The Inventor's Heptilemma. Written and read by Joshua Todd Basner. Those of us who have ever done something with our life will be well aware of the overwhelming frustration that is trying to harmonize a life of multiple pursuits. School, work, leisure, relationships, all of these things war violently for supremacy over our time. And, like a pianist trying to keep up with an orchestra while having forgotten to bring the concerto score, we often find ourselves overwhelmed, enraged, and exhausted by the cacophony of mortal demands. It seems, therefore, that the only reasonable course of action is that we must find a way to clone ourselves multiple times so that all our obligations will be done for us. Unfortunately, for nearly all individuals, such cloning technology is not immediately available. I say nearly all, because there was one for whom it would soon become available. Dr. Felix Faulkner was a peculiar man. At least, so the testimony of most townsfolk went. If you were to meet Dr. Faulkner on one of his many, and recently more frequent, outings, it would certainly not take you long to notice some very glaring peculiarities marking him out from the everyday upper-class Victorian countryman. His attire was not particularly peculiar. The tweed frock coat, silk topper, and polished cane were by no means eccentricities. But what you will soon realize is that this everyday gentleman's attire is a cloak for a horde of oddities, which earn him quite a number of odd looks from the many people whom he was too socially awkward to approach. If you were to converse along with him, which is unlikely, as he rarely cared to spend too much time doing something so terrifying as talking to strangers, he would soon enough start fidgeting with one of those many odd, and by some people's standards useless, gadgets and gizmos that he happens to have on him at all times. Perhaps he would start pulling from his coat a pocket an oddly shaped little box of gears which he had a purpose that the layman could only ever guess at. Or perhaps he would start messing with the minuscule strings tucked under the side of his top hat, which triggered whatever device he managed to effortlessly hide within that silken stovepipe. Or maybe he would simply mess with the magnifying glass on his cane, which also doubles as a Geiger counter, something people would find much more interesting if Geiger counters had actually been invented. And if you were to run off the testimony of purely the townsfolk who passed him on the street, or the fellows who were on the outer fringes of his limited friend group, you would be given no impression stronger than that he was a walking conundrum of awkward peculiarity. The truth was that he himself was by no means unacquainted with the fact that many people saw him as a peculiarity, even if all his scientific genius was vain to pinpoint what was the exact case-by-case reason for this peculiar impression. The fact of his own personal peculiarity was something which he had started to become acquainted with ever since his wealthy father used to scold him for trying to invent a steamboat in the bathtub instead of dreaming to become, like his father, a man of business. That Dr. Faulkner stood out like a sore thumb in the world was only more evident to him the first time he had ever presented one of his inventions to a patent board. The resulting scorns of laughter from those upper-class businessmen upon hearing of the possibility of an actual flying machine assured nothing more than that he was also this last time he would ever present one of his inventions to a patent board. Having quite come to despise these men of business, all except, of course, his beloved late father, who, for all his faults, was still his father, Dr. Faulkner took all the inheritance left by his parents to their only child, and ran away from London, hoping that the country folk of Kent would at least be more welcoming. And, while the dwellers of the beautiful land of Kent were much more far and few between, he sadly found that they were most certainly not much more willing to immediately accept some random wealthy London runaway, who had purchased an isolated mansion as a storehouse for his own well-dressed lanky corpse, alongside the brazen corpses of those many gizmos, gewgaws, and gadgets which filled the air with steam and hued the fields with crash parts. Having now lived in Kent for just shy of a year, poor Dr. Faulkner had only found a very limited group of friends who appreciated his presence as they ought. And among these friends was the family of the local parish priest for the Church of England, one Reverend Henry Harper. Being close friends with his local priest family was, for many reasons, a wonderful development for the shy Dr. Faulkner. The most important of these reasons was, obviously, that the man was a priest and Dr. Faulkner a Christian. But another reason, which, if I so risk implying any impiety or ulterior motives on the part of our eccentric friend by naming it in the same paragraph as the former, was that Reverend Henry Harper's family had a boast of children, which included one beautiful young daughter. Her name was Viola. Having lived nearly a year since making her acquaintance, Felix was just as overjoyed to find that he still got to see her as he was dismayed that he simply could not see her more. But, as always, even through the most mixed of feelings, love prevails. So, while he did inwardly grumble and groan that the act of confessing his love to her openly still stood ahead as a responsibility, he was none the less spending much time fondly treasuring the thought of all the graceful words and deeds of hers which so entrance his full admiration and attention. It was Sunday afternoon. He was strolling dandily home after having dropped his evening suit off to be cleaned. Humming what he could remember of a tune he had recently heard in concert, he nearly leapt with each step, overjoyed at how notably personless this field-flank sun-bathed country path was. He had, earlier that day, been entreated to the wonderful privilege of an invitation. This invitation was delivered by none other than his spiritual father himself. Viola Harper had, with some girlish glee, learned recently of a concert of Bach that was to be opened to the public at a nearby Lutheran church. What Lutherans were doing in England is beyond me, but they were certainly welcome in Kent so long as they brought Bach. As her father was aware of Felix's recent obsession with music, the good priest was kind enough to approach his young spiritual protege with the news, as well as a gladly accepted offer to reserve a seat for the young Felix among the Harper family. I'm personally quite sure that kind Reverend Harper had absolutely no idea why it was that Dr. Faulkner had only recently gotten so dramatically obsessed with music. Had he known that it was for the same reason that Faulkner's voice broke when he answered the invitation, I am not quite sure if the gentle Reverend Harper would have ever anticipated the news. The truth is, I am not quite sure if even the graceful Viola Harper herself would have anticipated the news. It is amazing how much the human heart is able to hide. While Faulkner was inwardly bombarded with the nervous heart palpitations and stomach cramps the moment she spoke his name, she was simply greeted by a reserved and quiet gentleman who gave her little more acknowledgment than a few civilities and maybe the occasional smile. Her father, to whom Dr. Faulkner was much more comfortable displaying closeness without fear of rejection, had told his young Viola a number of intriguing stories about all of the odd hobbies which consumed the eccentric inventor's time. And while these stories rendered her curious beyond words to be entreated to a tete-a-tete with this eccentric fellow, his evasiveness to share any word with her longer than a monosyllable made her quite certain that he was content to keep his relationship to her constrained merely to the person of her father. Had she any idea that it was he who was sending those monthly anonymous love letters and flowers, she may well have fainted. But as his ulterior motives were safely concealed under a mask of monosyllabic civilities, all anticipation of hearing the news, and thus all preparation for pleasantly receiving it, was well outside of actuality. When Felix's vast, glowing stone mansion finally became clear over the pretty green, rolling hills of Kent, his heart was in his chest with joy. I say his mansion, but it might be more just to refer to the place as a castle. He had purchased a large, unwalled keep dating perhaps somewhere to the 1500s for two reasons in particular. Firstly, because stone resists explosions very well, and there are plenty of those in Felix's line of work. And secondly, because it was cheap. Seriously, you would not believe the bargain prices of English castles in the 1880s. Walking along the large lake beside which his castle was perched, he began to be reminded of several months' worth of failed experiments. Fallen among the pretty flower bushes that lined the path, crashed below the shady willows that dotted the land, and floating within the large pond that reflected the sun, were various chassis of rusted metal, each one associated with an attempt at flying, an attempt at driving, or an attempt at diving, which went miserably and laughably wrong. He would have laughed at all the remembrances of those failed experiments, were it not for the fact that those remembrances came alongside the remembrance of all the angry notes he received from nearby farmers who were rather miffed at finding shrapnel among their livestock. Felix sighed, pausing in his walk at a substantially large motor car which he had long ago left crashed among a sickly willow tree. If only he had more time. Then he could just clean up after himself. As his previously gay mood darkened with every piece of uncleaned up metal that he passed, he found that he went from skipping down the path to slogging. By the time he had reached his front door, he was practically sulking, internally kicking himself that he did not have enough time. This torrent of sulking was paused for a moment when he had a brief moment of panic as he tried to search his frock coat for his house keys. Blast! Those keys always fell out. Just as he was beginning to contemplate having to shatter one of those first-story windows again, his fingertips were greeted with the cold touch of a pair of brawn keys in his left pocket. Forgetting his panic, and remembering his sulking, our friend Felix tried to unlock the heavy oaken door, only to realize he had forgotten to lock it in the first place. As such, he sighed, put the keys away, and shoved the door open. He breathed a sigh of annoyance as he stepped into the vast, elegant hall of his castle. Even the inside of his home was messy. He frowned as he looked around the scarlet carpet, on which were numerous stains from his various chemistry projects and failed attempt at French cooking. He grimaced at bringing his gaze up to the mountains of books which filled the small table and velvet wing-backs before a cold fireplace, the result of many hours of wishing he was more well-read. And he practically groaned as he brought his gaze up to the second-story balcony of the castle's main hall. The elegant Gothic stonework which adorned this main hall was covered with various silk waistcoats, wool trousers, and tweed frock coats, which he had hoped to dry by throwing over whatever banister or gargoyle he could. The grand hall slept soundly under this blanket of mess, oblivious to the annoyance of its owner. The vastness and beauty of that grand hall was as much of a blessing to a clean owner as it was a curse to a messy one. His sighs and footsteps resounded loudly as he slunk his way off to the right to find a stairway upstairs. For many of us, living in a Gothic castle is not a terribly familiar experience. But living in a Gothic castle may include many experiences which are much too familiar for us all. For our eccentric friend, one of these experiences consisted of running into his room and throwing himself onto his bed in a fit of annoyance, hoping that the midday sun streaking through the window might freeze in its course so that a few more hours of precious working time could be clutched before it fled. This is an experience so familiar to us that it was only a few variables away from making Felix's sufferings just about as normal as any angsty young chap. Were it not for the fact that Felix's bedroom floor was carpeted in velvet, that his furniture was trimmed with mahogany, and that his room was hewn with random pieces of mechanistic truggery, Felix would have been just the same as any one of everyday layman's number. Well, now that I write it, most of every angsty young man has a floor hewn with random pieces of truggery, but I doubt it is ever so interesting or possibly useful as that which hewed Felix's floor. He threw his cane and topper into the same corner where a pile of canes and toppers had been developing. His mind was rushing with all sorts of wild ideas of how he could try fixing his problem. What would he start with first? Where even would he start in reorganizing this life of his, which seemed to be bursting like a train with clogged smokestack? Oh, stupid, stupid, stupid. His father was right. He should have organized his life better. At least he wouldn't be sitting here kicking himself for everything that he wasn't. No, no, he needed to stop thinking about himself. Remember what Father Harper said. You do not find security in yourself. Wait, Father Harper? No, he couldn't remember what Father Harper said. And his mind would just wander to the Harper family, which would make his mind wander to Viola Harper, which would make his mind wander to having to confess his love to Viola Harper, which would make his mind wander to how much of an idiot he was because he could not confess his love to Viola Harper, which would make his mind wander. Anyways, it would make his mind wander. If only he could be more like other people. Then he wouldn't have to deal with the amazing rush of absolute genius that overwhelms him like a torrent every time he has the slightest inkling of an idea and fills him for one glorious moment with hope. Amazing rush. No, no, it's too great a price to be other people. That's not what he wants. If only other people could be more like him. If only there were more Felixes in the world. More people who could sympathize with this exhaustion and downward spiral of his. Perhaps even more people who would be willing to help and encourage him, instead of dragging him down with complaint after complaint after complaint. If only there were more Felixes. If only there were more Felixes. If only there were more. Yes! That was it! 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 Felix leapt out of his bed like a child on Christmas morning. More Felixes! Yes! He laughed, lifted to the moon with joy. Or did he lift laughing to the moon with joy? Why didn't he ever think of it before? He had already done it many times over with a flock of fattened geese as a means of paying off the townsfolk. Who's to say that his genetic project wouldn't also work with humans? He lifted laughing to the moon with joy. Semantics did not matter. What mattered now was Felixes. Felix antics? Semantelixes? Either one. John Thatcher knocked carefully on the vast ancient door. A silence ensued. He gazed around cautiously, watching the evening sun cast amazing glancing light off the 3 stories of Gothic arch windows that broke through the vast stone facade towering high above the grove of willows around him. Birds sang peacefully in the trees, the only sound in this peaceful stillness besides the wind whispering through the trees. John pulled his satchel up his shoulder and his cape over his sleeve. He pulled his mum's old pocket watch from his dirty waistcoat. As much as the long weight was wearing on his patience, he was able to keep his strength long enough to be rewarded by the sound of footsteps running in the vast chambers from across that door. The giant door groaned as it fell away. In its frame was the exasperated face of the inventor. Had this been the first errand on which Dr. Faulkner had sent him, John certainly would have stumbled back in terror at the sight of a fluffy-haired, soot-faced, wide-eyed, smiling doctor with sleeves rolled up and his hair drooped down. But as this was at least the 100th time that this had happened already, John simply reached into his ruddy leather satchel, dug for the various devices which had been requested of him. Dr. Faulkner, your shopping list including the flask, the book, there, pickle. Can I ask what the pickle's for? The inventor grabbed each object in turn and gathered into his arms. You may indeed. Sandwiches simply are not the same without them. Anyways, I thank you for your service. The inventor was about to close the door before his mandatory momentary lapse in remembrance shattered. Oh yes, that's right. He pulled himself back into the doorway. I need to pay you for it, don't I? John waited patiently as the inventor dug into his pocket for a moment. Well, John, let me see. Where's your pence? Gracious me, I never have those things. Anyways, here, have a random piece of bronze. Or is it gold? I Whichever one, I'm sure it's worth something. Good day, friend. Having the unidentified shiny metal down in the awaiting pawns of the yarn farmer, the eccentric inventor disappeared behind a slammed door, leaving a confused John Thatcher to stand out in the curious serenity of the evening sun. Praised Dr. Felix Faulkner, having achieved all that was necessary for his project, dashed through the grand hall, down the spiral staircase, through the massive wooden door, and into the long, musty hallway, which terminated, after the course of many cobwebs, in a closed oaken door. Most people do not happen to have a crypt underneath our home. It is for that reason that many of us have trouble quite understanding what it would be like to have a secret lair full of inventions within said crypt. But I'm quite sure that many of us would actually find the idea quite a bit more human than it may seem at first meditation. Nonetheless, regardless of how much any of us may relate to the idea of living above a deep, dark dungeon full of mechanistic wonders too dear to see the light of day, it remains true that Dr. Faulkner could relate to this on a very literal level. After all that you have learned about our friend Felix, it should make sense why he should be so inclined towards a hidden underground lair. It was the perfect place for him to slave endlessly over sketches and schematics without the scrutinizing eyes of the world to penetrate his immersion. The crypt was such a perfect play place for him that he simply wished the 15th century construction crew had decided to let in a little more sunlight and ventilation into the den of rotting corpses and musty cobwebs. Inwardly thanking himself for having invented the scented gas lamp candle, Felix slowed in his excitable dash. His slowing footsteps resounded solemnly in the darkness. He strode calmly past the wide hallway supported by pillars that seemed to grow from the roof like evenly spaced stalactites. Passing below the Gothic arches of these pillars, he smiled up at all the dusty illustrations of angels and saints, whose paint had long faded under layers of webage and must, and was only visible in the light of the gas lamp chandeliers. In the flickering darkness which these industrial lamps struggled to keep at bay, it almost seemed like the crypt extended on forever at his left and right. Of course, he knew it didn't, but it was always fun to pretend. Strolling a little further brought him to a cross-section between two different halls. Standing at the heart of this cross-shaped crypt, he knew that to his right and left were nothing more than the massive hordes of machinery, parts, and tools, gathered in the darkness at respectful distances away from the unmoved stone coffins. Well, the belly of darkness forbade him from seeing more than a few feet in front of him. A few feet was all that he needed. For in that scanty light which the crypt's middle section afforded, Felix beheld his latest invention, lurking dramatically on the edge of the darkness. Sighing with a smile, he turned to the old mahogany table to his right, and emptied his loaded arms onto that messy, clutter-hewn, paper-strewn wooden surface. He pulled one schematic out of the many with such hastiness that he nearly tore it in two. He then proceeded to pace back and forth in front of this massive brazen invention of his. This device, which lurked so menacingly behind him, was a thing of very peculiar shape indeed. It was large enough and heavy enough that, were it to topple over, it would not be very fun for our poor inventive friend. The bulk of it seemed to take the shape of an egg, with one large door in its very center, sealed shut with a vast vault-like spoked handle. Innumerable little pipes and gas lines ran out of the sides of it. All of these gas lines converged on a cylindrical unit at the very top of it, standing high like the pinnacle of a cathedral, and perched on that cylindrical unit was a small glass flask, filled with exactly 20 milliliters of a curious pink solution. Felix stopped his pacing, gazing up at the thing. "Oh, blast," he muttered to himself. "I knew I already had the flask. Happens every time. Oh well, I suppose I'd get started." He turned to the one skull in the crypt, whose name was Alex, short for Alexander, of course. Alex was sitting patiently, lying on the ground beside one of the nearby pillars. He had been good company during many an experiment. Felix often felt bad because he never actually knew if the poor guy's name was during life was actually Alex. Even if it was Alex, it was still probably somewhat disrespectful for his skull to be tripped over as often as it was. Well, Alex, prepare yourself, my friend. Felix stepped slowly up to the awkwardly shaped brazen behemoth before him. His heart began to hammer as he clambered up the short step ladder to reach that little glass flask like a child reaching for a piece of fruit. Plucking the glass from its place, he uncorked it. He could not help but tremble all over as he ran his hands through his hair a number of times before pulling out a loose follicle. What was he so nervous about? He had tested the same genetic experiment many times over with sheep and chickens. What was there to be so scared of now? He dropped the follicle into the aqueous solution. It fizzled, bubbled, and foamed. It should be enough. He corked the flask once more and returned it to its previous lofty position. With a sigh of uncertainty, he climbed down and shoved the stepladder aside with a resounding squeal. He took a short moment to check and double-check everything, whether it be physically connected to his invention or be mentally retained in his mind. Wait! Had he remembered to install the failsafe? He reached into his waistcoat pocket with a sigh of relief. A pair of keys was still there. He had indeed. He was going to be very grateful for that failsafe soon enough. Sighing once more, he brought a trembling hand up to the massive lever on one side of this giant shining egg. It was now or never. With a heave, he threw the lever down. Felix had had many an invention quite literally blow up in his face. Were I to recount the many stories of the various gadgets which exploded upon their first use, your sympathies for him would probably only be matched by your laughter. Probably the strangest experience of something blowing up in his face was the automatic hairdresser. Turns out that pressurized pneumatic power is not a good candidate for trimming sideburns. Suffice it to say, by the end of it, his burns were not simply on his sides. It seems to him that nearly every invention he could whip up was fated to explode, no matter how thoroughly he had thought to prepare. I hope you can understand, therefore, why it was that Felix, having pulled the giant lever of doom for the first time ever, leapt away like a cat from a gunshot and disappeared underneath his waiting splintered table. He closed his eyes as the hissing of steam, the bursting of bolts, and the sparking of currents ran out in such a perfect symphony of mechanistic harmony that Ferdinand Laguerre would have thought it too musically beautiful to have included in his magnum opus of mindfully mindless cacophony. Sure enough, the poor inventor thought, this was going to be a mess to clean up. He felt the tremble in the ground grow into a quake with all sorts of papers and parts raining off the table around him. He clutched for dear life to the leg of this table as the giant machine before him screamed, reared, and roared. Like a great avalanche of mechanical mischief and mayhem, he clutched his lanky legs to his chest in terror, bracing himself for the great bombastic explosion. Come un colpo di cannone! This was it. This was it, and it explodes. He just knew it. The scream was so loud now that it would have scared away the very ghosts of the crypts themselves. He clutched his eyes closed and his legs tight as all in one terrifying moment everything dropped silent. This is it. It has exploded for sure. The whole world was dead silent. All he heard was his heart hammering in his ears. I'm to open my eyes and see my invention exploded into 1,000 pieces. The inventor opened his eyes to see his invention not exploded into 1,000 pieces. Oh! So far, so good. Slowly and cautiously, lest a wrong step trigger a cascade, Felix brought his lanky body out from under the table. He stretched himself to a standing position with his shadow casting darkly off the brown surface of that massive beast. It was terrifyingly silent. The piercing darkness lurked around him like the screams of a humanity which nobody ever heard. Slowly, the trembling inventor approached his creation. And then he tripped. Felix's face slammed against the stone just at the foot of his invention. Angered that his moment of drama had been so interrupted by his fleshless, disembodied friend, he pulled himself again to his feet. He dusted himself off. Well, that was it for theatrics. Shrugging off any hopes of a grandiose reveal, Felix reached up, turned the vault door, and casually swung the big lump of steel open. A massive cloud of steam poured out in a vast storm, scalding his face in his hot, metal-scented folds. Felix cringed and coughed. Why did it always have to be steam? Why couldn't he open the door of his invention one day and be greeted with, oh, I don't know, a swarm of rose petals or cute fluffy kittens or something? But, as frustrated as he was with a bombard of scalding hot steam, he had not forsaken hope that the white veil would fall away and reveal a worthwhile sight. And oh, what sudden joy it was when indeed it did! For sitting there in the leather cushions of the seat in the center of the vast machine of incredible power was a lanky figure, his long limbs clothed in a fine blue suit, his boyish face curtained with neat brown curls, and his happy grin saturated with curious intelligence. Felix smiled to shake the hand of his new great companion. There in the belly of that beast, smiling back at its creator, was the first ever human clone, a freshly formed fellow Felix Faulkner. The 7 Days of Creation. Felix was a man of practicality. He always considered things practically when he did them. Most of the time, this meant before he did them. Sometimes, it meant while he did them, and on some special occasions, it meant after he did them. But regardless of the time frame relative to when he did them, he always considered them practically. One of these practical considerations was the consideration of ethics. Of course, it did not pass Felix's attention that cloning himself once was probably unethical. And as cloning oneself once was probably unethical, Felix took a very practical course of action to address this possibly troubling reality. He addressed it with a very simple deduction that followed thusly. If cloning oneself once is indeed unethical, then cloning oneself multiple times is also unethical. As such, if a practical man is going to clone himself, he might as well couple efficiency with cruelty, and do it several times over. 7 times to be exact. Why 7? Because it was a biblical number, of course. It was the number of creation, and the number of days in the week. And if worse came to worse, and every clone ends up being so lazy that he can only work once per week, it also makes for a wonderfully efficient solution. Practicality at its finest. Or so he hoped. Another practical consideration that good Dr. Faulkner made was the consideration of failure. Felix had seen enough inventions fail already, that he knew it was nearly certain to happen again. As such, he installed a failsafe to his cloning machine. If at any point any of his clones ended up malfunctioning, he had a very efficient means of remedying the problem. An invention of his which he referred to as simply the clone getter awayer. This invention, when activated, had a very simple and straightforward purpose. It would make all the clones, wherever they may happen to be at the moment of his activation, disappear. He had, of course, wondered for some time how it would be that he would install a clone getter aware without either his clones or, worse yet, his friends figuring out where it was and inquiring to its purpose. After having scrupled this question many times over, he decided upon 2 very logical courses of action. The first was that the clone getter aware, or CGA, pronounced Gaga, would be activated by a master key carried by its inventors at all times. That way, no unknowing person would activate this device accidentally. The second was that he would install the Kaga in a door. That is because doors are the place where people would be least surprised to see a keyhole. For added protection, he made sure that the door in question would be that of the first door leading from the lawn hallway to the crypt. That way, the greatest possible risk of the Kaga being activated accidentally was if Dr. Faulkner himself were to confuse his keys. A possible risk which he admittedly had probably not sufficiently addressed. Now that nearly all Chekhovian revolvers have been wildly and haphazardly thrown on every available mantle space, it seems expedient to go from describing the plans to detailing the action. As of now in his story, whether Felix's invention would carry out as he intended has yet to be determined. But at least insofar as the events of that first week were concerned, cloning himself 7 times seemed to be something of a plus. The first thing he did with his clones was that he gave them all names. It was a rather easy thing to do, as he simply named them all Felix. After having passed that trivial but all too necessary act, he set himself to work on the undeniably arduous task of figuring out what work his new helpers would do. The rest of that Sunday was spent planning with his new army of his, and hoping of finding each one a daily task to begin upon the first day's start. They all awoke bright and early the next day, each one exuberant about his newfound existence. Imagine the incredible joy of a little child who has all of a sudden been brought from darkness to light by being allowed to tour an unexplored garden. That was the wonder of these freshly created clones. They were experiencing the wonder of separating light from dark. And seeing their sense of wonder as an opportunity for willing labor, Felix quickly advanced on the opportunity and set each of them to work. The first chore he hoped to have done would be that of indoor cleaning. As such, he set 3 of the clones to cleaning off the carpet in the grand hall, 3 of the clones to cleaning off the clothing over the gargoyles, and the last of the clones to cleaning off the massive stack of books which were filling the various chairs. Of course, the clone did so by reading them, something which Felix had been meaning to do for some time. This allowed Felix wonderfully ample opportunities to head down to town, run some errands, and hopefully catch a passing glance of Viola from afar. When he returned home, he was pleased to find his castle's grand hall restored to such an image of its former grandeur that he was able to run off to bed, read, and write some trivial letters, and sleep contented. And the evening and the morning were the first day. The second day, Felix awoke with an unfortunate realization. This was the realization that he had set a clone to spending the entirety of the first day on the one thing that he had been meaning to do most. That is, actually reading all those books. Only to wake up the next day and notice that the real Felix had absorbed none of the information of said books, probably courtesy of his not actually having read them himself. He was starting to realize some of the practical shortcomings of his previous strategy. With this having been the first trial run of his new invention, he was starting to feel like a soul lost between the firmament of heaven and the infinitude of the waters. Fortunately, however, he was not the only one that felt lost. So at least that meant that nobody was judging him. When he had finally awoken and marched down from his tower into the grand hall, he was greeted with a mess of handsomely dressed Felixes all standing in an awkward ring in the room as if they were automatons waiting for an order. Being somewhat unsure what chore exactly to give them courtesy of the new-found doubt in his own sense of practicality, Felix decided to send them outside. To be precise, he sent them onto the pond, giving them one of his old steamboat concepts designs alongside the vague orders to use the crane thingy to pull all the rusted pieces of shrapnel which were littering about the bottom of the pond after a number of markedly failed attempts of buoyancy. With his clones safely out of sight, Felix took the afternoon to read. It proved to be a successful strategy, up until the moment that all the clones slogged through the front door, a dripping, muddy mess. They sulkily informed their master that the steamboat which they hoped to use to recover wrecked craft decided to join the wrecked craft, and that, without warning, the boiler exploded, sending all 7 clones flying every which way. You would not believe the maddened adventures they had after that. Supposedly, one Felix landed in a bulrush. Another Felix landed in a wheat field. The third Felix landed on a bull rushing in a wheat field. Apparently, one Felix flew so high that he became one with the wind. Another Felix flew so far that he became one with a cock. The third of these Felixes flew so high and so far that he became one with a windcock. And the 7th Felix, well, the 7th Felix actually didn't go that far. And while they were all alive and safe, the real Felix decided at best to give his clones the rest of the evening off, as most of yesterday's gun-ho enchantment seemed to have somewhat dissipated between the moment that the boiler exploded and the moment that an angry pair of horns nearly became a device of impalement. In the evening and the morning were the second day. On the third day, Felix awoke in an unusual spirit of excitement. For the sake of his clones, he decided it best to try and give them a lighter, more pleasant activity for the rest of the day. And so he set them all to tending to the garden. He figured it should be no trouble. So, having handed them a growth serum and a weed killer potion, he took his cane, hat, and coat and ran off for town. When he returned, he was pleased to find a pretty row of flower beds were blooming happily from beside the path, not a weed to mar their company. When he arrived inside, however, he was shocked to find that one of his clones had a dramatically enlarged nose, so much so that his eyes were nearly invisible besides the nostrils. In hindsight, he probably should have warned them about the dangers of directly sniffing the growth serum. But, as Felix had invented a cure for the growth serum, this was not the first time this had happened by any means. The problem was quickly cured, and everyone was soon comfortably in bed. In the evening and the morning were the third day. Day 4 went with quite a similar success to Day 3. Felix set his clones to odd, insignificant jobs about the property. But similarly to Day 3, Day 4 did have its own share of scares. Not so much in the form of an enlarged nose, but an unhappy workforce. It had come to light that some of the workers felt underappreciated, and these complaints were taken right to the top. It was startling at first to see the first streak of rebellion, especially considered that it was somewhat less provoked than it would have been had it occurred on one of the other days. But he handled it with tact in telling them that he will work on it tomorrow. And evening and the morning were the third day. On Day 5, Felix began the morning with a meeting of the Felixes. Gathering in the grand hall, they discussed some means of appreciating the Felixes more. It was something of a juggle, almost like a savage world without mankind, and at that hall everyone was attempting to speak over the other. Or was he trying to speak over itself? Felix had never been so worn out with debating himself. Exhausted, they went to bed. In the evening and the morning were the fifth day. The sixth day began in much the same way. The Felixes gathered to meet, and while they nonetheless still all vied for dominance like jungle animals, they could at least agree on a few things. The first was that naming them all Felix was horrendously confusing. As such, they decided on naming each Felix after a day of the week. The second was that the Felixes also needed their time out of the house. The castle. Wary to keep them from gaining too much power and realizing that a town was to the east, Felix allowed his clones all the land they wanted, so long as they keep their roaming to the west. And they, under no circumstances, allowed two Felixes to be seen at once. The only thing Dr. Faulkner feared more than an uprising among his clones was an uprising among the folks. With that out of the way, they all went to bed. In the evening and the morning of the sixth day. On the seventh day, the Felixes rested. The real Felix himself awoke early to go off to church. Surprisingly enough, however, all of his clones were not only apathetic, but actively antagonistic to the idea of going to church. Even the idea of each going to different churches. Confused, and perhaps a little concerned, Dr. Faulkner decided to simply be off by himself to where he could enjoy a day of fellowship, worship, and communion. It was, to say the least, something of an exhausting weight off his chest for that week to be done. Jealousy. After the long week of work, church was a warm embrace from an old friend. The hymns of the organ, homilies of Reverend Harper, and the ceremony of the Eucharist were together like a beautiful harmony after an endlessly noisy week. His one grief during that wonderful church service was that the beauty of it all served just as well to solace his exhaustion as it did to condemn his folly. He even found himself wondering if, in the light of all this transcendental wonder, the past week will ever have any good effect on his future self. Since last Sunday, God had given him 7 whole days for Felix to use wisely. The question, of course, was if he had, in fact, used them wisely. It was a problem which must have been weighing heavily on poor Felix. It was some time after the service had finished, as the peaceful organ was still filling the church with harmony, and the chattering parishioners were still filling the narthex with footsteps. Felix had been one of the first to shuffle out of the door, unable to stay and chat with a single fellow churchgoer, save the mandatory shaking of the priestly hand. The young inventor was expecting to begin his journey home by passing through that cobble wall at the end of the church's front lawn. But, before stepping foot a little further than the church, he froze, standing still in a tense bliss as he watched the sun peering from above the grove of trees that skirted the cobble wall at a distance and casted their long rustic shadows over the mossy barricade. The freshly green leaves and colorfully flowered grass both seemed to sway at the steady pulse of the organ, but interrupting all illusion of solitude, for indeed all solitude is an illusion, Felix was jarred by a familiar voice behind. "Hello, Felix. Why the rush?" Felix leapt and wheeled about to see, standing invitingly atop a set of cobble steps, and crowned from behind with a stony sunrise-bathed church facade, was the lean, robe-draped figure of the man himself, Reverend Henry Harper of the Church of England. He unknowingly stood before the church facade as if it were the back of a comedically large English Gothic throne. "Oh, Father Harper, I just hope to get some errands run, that is all." Father Harper stepped down from his stony stage to approach his young spiritual protege. "Is everything all right, then? You don't tend to leave so soon." Now, if Felix were an honest man, he would admit that the two reasons that he usually stayed were firstly, was that he was madly in love with the daughter of the man with whom he spoke, to the point that he simply wanted to sit in the pew as she helped clean up. And secondly, that he felt much more freedom to be alone with God when he did not have the possible threat of his clones having accidentally blown up his entire household while he was away. As neither, "Hey, I'm in love with your daughter," or "Hey, I cloned myself 7 times and therefore do not have much ability to dedicate my time to God," sounded like any appropriate response in this situation, Felix simply shrugged. "I suppose not." He inwardly kicked himself for his stupid obviousness in every motion, and began to hope beyond hope that Viola would soon come out of those church doors to grace him for a moment with the sight of her before demanding her papa's attention and asking that he come inside to talk with Mamma. His hopes would soon be realized, although not quite to the perfect extent that he had hoped. Father Harper was about to say something, but whatever he was about to say was interrupted, for, as if they heard the voice of an angel above, the attention of both men was stolen from behind by a beautiful tone which, after a week of hearing nothing by his own voice 7 times, was the most perfect thing Felix could have ever heard. "Papa, may I join you?" Both gentlemen turned to face the direction of the church as, out of that open-mouthed temple from which the most beautiful harmonies ever composed were emerging, had appeared Beauty in the very flesh, her flawless English skin draped elegantly in a dark blue dress, which soured around her legs, making her seem to float on the spout of a midnight fountain, and wrapped tightly around her thin waist, over her delicate shoulders, and close down her long arms. The moment Felix looked her in the face, he averted his eyes, knowing full well that even a glance more would make his legs fall out from under him. But the image of that face, shaped with such beautiful symmetry along the chin, flanked with such pretty locks about the eyes, and filled with such girlish delight within the gaze, was forever cemented in the mind of the young inventor. He simply kept his gaze down at the hem of her dress, watching its milly frails dance as she seemed to float on the wind to stand beside her father. Reverend Harper grinned at his daughter with a look that Felix burned to give her one day. "My sweet Viola, have you made it known to Edmund that you will walk alone with Mamma home?" "Yes, he is fully aware." "Then I see no reason why not." "Felix." The inventor, who realized that he was staring down at the ground for much too long, looked up to find that, oh dear God, don't lose balance! Viola was smiling at him from beside her father. It seems my daughter here has spoiled my intentions to you. I was wondering if I may walk home with you, and if you would be so kind if Viola may join us. It may be nice to be somewhat more acquainted with the man that shall end up sitting next to for 2 whole hours of Bach tomorrow. Sitting next to... Oh, good Lord! Please don't let these legs break out now. Not next to her father. His heart leapt and his world spun to where he thought he would vomit. But somehow, he was able to let a few words pass. Fair enough. Please, do join me. And with a bow to the lady whose face was currently bombarding his every sensation, he turned and began his stroll, with his priest being the only person between himself and the woman whose name he dare not even utter in private. And to the certain astonishment of anyone who could know a thing about Felix's feelings for Viola, neither the object of his affection nor her father suspected a smidge of the violent thoughts which were so forcing his every response to manifest in the form of curious reservedness. At the very beginning of his walk, Felix was under attack by a ferocious herd of several anxieties, each one making the necessary act of jovial conversation a thing of torment. As soon as he thought he had gotten over the leg-weakening reality that Viola Harper was only a few feet away, he was suddenly overcome by the remembrance of another fear equally as terrifying. What would these kind, respectful Harpers think if, while they were walking Dr. Felix Faulkner to the front door, they happen upon a doorman who also happens to be a Dr. Felix Faulkner? Of course, Reverend Harper was somewhat aware with the occasional eccentricities of his friend Felix. Something so wild, and frankly so unchristian, as the eccentricity of having cloned oneself? Is that something for which any good man would be prepared? And as soon as he remembered that Reverend Harper was not going to be the only one to be entreated to have Felix cloned, he felt his head begin to swim with its old anxieties. He could only hope that all Felix clones would be indoors by the time they reached home. But even then, not even anxiety is a disease which is incurable against the tonic of a brisk walk with a couple of close friends. Slaving his mind to produce a friendly, unworried Felix for his father and beloved, he began to realize that his latest alter ego was becoming so natural that it was seeping into his very core. Soon he was walking and talking delightfully about everything from sermons to flowers, hanging with a precious dearness on every word spoken from the lips of his female friend. The trees swayed unaffectedly in the breeze as the group of three good friends strolled side by side. In some enchanting way, the three seemed to be a symbol of that sacred act of devotion which binds man and woman together till death do them part. The young, happily skipping inventor, and the beautiful, gracefully flying daughter were together led by the black-coated priest unto the altar of matrimony which lay past the sunrise at the end of this meandering English hillside path. Standing in 2 long rows, like a fence between the sides of the path and the open, breeze-streaked hills, was a grove of trees, which stretched along with the path like joyful witnesses of the unison of man and wife. And simply abandoning his anxieties and allowing himself to truly speak to the woman to whom he was previously afraid of even signing a letter, Felix was becoming part of a portrait of love so transcendent that not even he could perceive it. His anxieties only reappeared for a short, yet terrifying moment, when he realized that they were nearing in on the place of dwelling. The grove of trees beside them were only beginning to dissipate, giving way to clear sight across the flower-strewn fields. Only a little further and the castle would be within sight. It made Felix's stomach turn to think about. He tried to hold to the conversation as much as he could, answering Viola's occasional remarks and questions about the odd pieces of rusted metal lying about besides the path. But while holding on, he scanned every last hilltop in hopes of confirming their want of any wandering Felix clone. At last, he held his breath as they scaled the largest knoll yet. He tried to keep his eyes down, knowing that the moment they passed that knoll would be the moment his castle was fully and inescapably within sight. and for one brief climax of all his terror, he heard Viola gasp in astonishment, frozen at the top of that knoll. My word, Felix! Felix leapt, nearly tripping as he wheeled about to face her face, only to instantly thereafter directly gaze to the ground, lest his weak legs give way and be sent rolling down over the other side of that hill. Is something the matter? Is something the matter? Felix, you must be mad. You're, you're, you're home. It's so beautiful. A moment of confused silence passed before Father Harper broke in with a laughter that revealed just how much he knew all along. My dear Viola, I told you it was going to be a thing to look at. You seem to have startled Dr. Faulkner. My apologies, Felix, on my daughter's behalf. She's been wanting to see her home dwelling ever since I told her how old the castle by the lake was. Oh, well, I see. Felix began, a relieved laughter that filled his voice with its signaturely pleasant joviality. It is quite a nice property. The three of them strolled, surrounded by a childlike lightness, passing under small groves of willows and through fresh gardens of flowers, before arriving at the castle's vast, ivy-flanked front door. Felix felt his chest turning with affection, warring with prudence as Viola sighed out an endless stream of girlish wonder at the poetic romance of the lakeside castle. She and her father would have been more than ready to lunch with Felix indoors. But, seeing that he was already lucky enough to make it to the front door, Felix decided not to risk their soon lunching with Felixes. And so, as painful as it was to him, he was forced to inform them that he was currently too busy for visitors, and so sent them walking blissfully home as he disappeared into the unseen depths of his mighty stone fortification. Who was that? Felix jumped and turned slowly around from locking the front door. His jovial mood was held in check when he turned around to see a mass of 7 blonde, curl-topped scowls standing around him in a semicircle that left him backed helplessly against the door. It was only because he realized that he was clutching the keys to that door in his right palm was he able to step forward and casually answer the question of the disgruntled Felix, as if it were any old inquiry on the weather or dinner plans. That was Viola Harper. She's the daughter of my priest. Felix froze, startled to find that the circle of clones was not going to open up for him. Instead, the Felixes were all glancing between each other, some mysterious look of concern on their faces, as if they knew of some danger that Dr. Faulkner did not. Finally, the Felix in the very center addressed his master. Are you and Miss Harper close? Felix felt his legs threatening to give way. He fidgeted with his hat and keys. Well, somewhat, and I... Um, she's really quite... You see, I don't really want to... He was growing hot to the face, pausing only once to inform some words. We'll be going to a Bach concert tomorrow by the nearby Lutheran church. The lead Felix, Thursday, judging by the grey frock and puffy cravat, seemed neither amused nor grieved at this show of weakness. And will we be allowed to come? Dr. Faulkner felt his stomach drop from his chest. His world all in one instant began to spin, and he feared that he would suddenly topple over into some sort of horror-stricken faint. He stammered, staggered, and stuttered, inwardly praying for anything to be his punishment besides the hell of answering that one question in the positive. When his lips finally began to form phrases, the first thing to exit into the open air was not one word, but rather a frantic slew of many. I was not there to hear it for myself, but I quite suspect it sounded something like no, 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 no. The row of Felixes, at each oncoming no, seemed to jolt as if stricken with a hammer, their eyebrows raising higher at each impact. By the point his slew passed, it was a wonder their eyebrows weren't all breaking through the ceiling. But they hardly had time to recover from the impact and proceed to insist their case before the respectable Dr. Faulkner waved his hat and cane dramatically in the air with a flustered gesticulation and stormed off, barging rudely between Thursday and Wednesday, and stomping off into some distant hall of the castle, his unceasing scream of negatives lingering long after his frantic footsteps had died away. That was it seemed. There goes any hope for the Felix clones to end up meeting Viola Harper. Fortunately for the Felix clones, Felixes are quite adept at making the impossible possible. The foyer of the church was alive with bustle. It was only just about the size of a small library, but the one open door at its far end, through which the vast sanctuary was seen, and the long Gothic windows at its near end, through which the street lamps were glowing, gave the dizzying illusion that this hall would have cozily accommodated twice the number of elegant ball gowns and evening suits as it did now. Certain chattering groups slowly filled out into this hall, contented with a brief surveyal of the snack table, and ready to find the reserved seats within the church sanctuary. Felix felt his heart rising to the back of his mouth before the moment he first met the eyes of a Harper from among the crowd. He felt his legs threatening to fall out from under him as Father Harper, his beautiful daughter at his side, broke off from their circle of conversation and floated through the hallway of humans to meet the love-struck inventor. He tried not to betray his terror by looking long at Viola, but, even with the short look he had, the image of her swaddled in a flowing white gown, which cascaded off her shoulders and over the floor like a shower of daisies, was forever imprinted within his mind. As she arrived before him, he risked bringing his gaze up to her face again, only to be lost in those crystalline eyes among the few curling locks of hair which were not tied up in a silver bun. A warmth leapt up in his chest, when a friendly smile crossed the lips below those eyes. Felix, feeling like he was lost in a dream, but moving like he was quite in control of his faculties, smiled politely and bowed to the lady. Father Harper's arm-in-arm position beside his daughter was the only place more enviable to Felix than the smiling position before her. This same Father Harper greeted Felix with a nod. "Felix, glad to see you here tonight." "Trust me, Father. Feelings are mutual." Felix glanced back to the enchanting face of Viola, only to find that she was not still smiling with as much intensity as he still was, an observation which slightly tempered his still expanding grin. He returned his eyes to meet the wire-rimmed spectacles upon the wise face of the priest. The gray-clothed reverend wore a look which spoke as much of the wisdom of Christian life as well as its pleasant, age-old joy. An arrow of panic struck Felix through the heart the moment Father Harper, realizing he had caught the inventor's gaze, informed the group something about going to find their seat, before gently tapping his daughter on the shoulder, releasing his grip on her arm, disappearing into the crowd, and leaving poor Felix Faulkner, for the first time in all his life, utterly alone with the delicate, daisy-draped frame, the golden smile-etched face, and the shining diamond eyes of Miss Viola Harper. Felix could only catch one desperate glance at the disappearing robe-draped back of the priest, seemingly oblivious to the plight of his children, before the young inventor brought his attention back to his female companion, his stomach leaping as he realized she was taking a few steps closer to her guest. She was no closer, as was ever appropriate for two respectful English people to stand when they conversed. But even that was much closer than Felix could have ever stood to her without feeling his heart begin to palpitate violently and his palms begin to shudder fearfully. He was about to make some trivial comment so as to fill the silence before it became obvious he was enjoying it, but all mental pathways had been destroyed, leaving him to internally stammer as he kept his eye on every subtle movement of her facial features for longer than should have been appropriate. Probably having picked up on the undue amount of attention, Well, most certainly having failed to discern its reason, Viola gave a slight musical chuckle before reaching one of her white-gloved hands up to pull aside some of her hair and reveal a pair of diamond earrings that were sparkling from underneath her golden hair. Their shimmer made her sparkling eyes seem to glow all the more, drawing Felix's eyes to the similar shimmer of the diamond necklace close around her flawless neck. His gaze only returned to her face once he heard her inhale, preparing to break the awkwardly blissful silence. Felix, how did you arrive having a home like you do? Was it inherited? Felix kept his gloved hands in front of him, fiddling with his double Albert watch chain and the silk lapel of his waistcoat as he answered, forcing his voice down to try and keep from laying bare his feelings. I purchased it. My family has no connection with Kent as far as I'm aware. Papa tells me you moved here from London. May I ask why is that? I wanted more room for my work. London was crowded and not very inviting to my hobbies. Well, we're glad that you can have come here. His heart leapt. A smile must have crossed his face. Thank you. A short silence ensued, in which Dr. Faulkner revelled blissfully in those last few words of his female companion. Growing nervous that her fidgeting with her hair was a sign of the silence overbearingness, Felix searched his mind for a means on his end to start a conversation. How long have you been listening to Bach? At this, a grin alighted upon her face. When she spoke, it sounded almost exasperated, as if the mere conversation subject itself was something which whelmed her senses. Papa has always had me learning organ and piano. I didn't realize how much I loved it until one day. I must have only been about 10 and 3 years of age. I happened upon a guest organist playing certain cantatas while practicing for our service. It was stunning, Felix. I've never heard feelings so human come out of the very walls themselves. That one day crumbled any notion I had before possessed that harmony was something restrictive and strange. Real harmony, I found, is like nature. It's free because it's orderly. I realized that a composer mirrors God in one of the most special ways, because he uses the restrictions of harmony to set us free. All of a sudden, she seemed to realize that she had ranted for quite some time without even a second for Felix to get a word within her impassioned speech. Slowly, she brought her eyes down. In short, it's been about 7 or so years. Your appreciation for music does not seem to be a casual endeavor, Felix realized, now that he was no longer fidgeting nervously with his watch chain and his hands were held confidently behind his back. His next words left his mouth before he had time to think them through. I believe we have quite a bit in common. In our appreciation of art, that is. You quite described how I feel about the harmony of mechanical tinkering. That it is free through its restrictions. Upon having her apology for the rant accepted, her eyes rose up, enlivened by the interest. That's fascinating. You must tell me more about your inventions one day. But, as of now, I need to go find Papa. It seems as if the musicians are warming up. Very well. I will soon join you. The beautiful head nodded before turning around and disappearing through the sanctuary doors down the naval hallway. Felix watched the whole while as that flowing white dress floated down across the red carpet between the oak pews, up until the moment it neared the very end of its procession and found a seat just out of sight of her observer. Felix sighed, letting his heart slowly decrescendo. He obviously had not remained in the narthex for the sake of chatting with people. Rather, he inwardly hoped to stand silent for a few moments, at least until his knees stopped trembling and his stomach stopped twisting. That, however, was a process which would not last long. For it is then that he suddenly noticed a face within the crowd that was much too familiar for comfort. Much too familiar. For it was a face which, prior to Sunday, he had only ever seen in a mirror. And it was standing Right there, besides a small, slightly ajar oak door on the right wall. He was not sure what had come over him, but something must have overtaken him. Whether fear or courage he could not tell. Whatever it was strong enough to force his hands so that only seconds later he found himself swiftly walking up to the unexpecting Felix, grabbing hold of the familiar man's silk lapel and shoving him through that door like one shoves a lazy dog, before soon thereafter gliding through the door himself, without even an onlooking eyelash to be batted at the strange confrontation. Had any onlookers been present at the scene unfolding behind closed doors, I can only imagine it would have been dismissed as some trick of the imagination, because, generally speaking, most people are quite unused to watching a man scold an exact image of himself as if he were a child. Shoving his clone into the stone wall of the empty church corridor, Felix leaned in so that he felt every gasp of the choking man's breath on his nose. He spoke through gritted teeth, never before having so wished to throw his fist into his own face. "What in the name of McDoodadiddle are you doing here? If you'd like now, I could. You're choking. Choking me. It's a big idea, you big fat finger noodle. Now tell me what you're here for." Felix was not quite sure what a fingerdoodle was, or why one would be fat as opposed to skinny. It was simply the first word that sounded offensive enough that could be said while evading the risk of swearing in a church. It only dawned on him afterwards that whatever a fat fingerdoodle was, if it were any insult on appearance, it went as much for him as it did for the clown. Fortunately, however, the other Felix did not seem aware of this, probably because he was too busy trying not to die of suffocation to notice the implication of his captor's threats. "What? No, I'll tell you." Felix, frustrated enough to choke the clone to death, but knowing he would probably only be more frustrated upon so doing, violently released his handlehold on the helpless clone's collar. He stepped back, crossing his arms as the wide-eyed Felix in front of him was frantically trying to untie his bow tie in a desperate attempt to turn his breath from spattering coughs into actual breath. When finally the gasping fool could breathe, he tried to recover as much of Felix's signature nonchalant cordiality as is possible when standing in front of somebody who just tried to choke you. "You probably want to know why I'm here. I'll tell you plainly. I'm here because of Viola." If ever there was a flabber to be gasted, it was Felix. His tongue refused to move as his stomach flipped into terrible knots upon the sound of that precious name escaping lips at once so familiar and also so horrible. You're... How in Handerdale did you... Why did you want to see..." Now it was the turn of the clone to be the tormentor. But, unlike his former captor, the clone did not torment through force, but through his dastardly smile of pleasure at his master's astonishment. "She's my Viola, after all. When I saw you walking with her, I knew it from the start. The way she so innocently and beautifully appreciates the national world, the way she seems to dance through life, the way she seems to look on the birds like she nurtured them herself. She is perfect, Felix, perfect for me." Felix stamped his foot hard enough that he grimaced at the pain of the floor slapping against his opera-pumped soul. "I do say, me! Listen, me! Viola is my to court, not yours! You're not me! Tell that to the 6 other Felixes in this building." Those words seemed to hit Felix with a force of 7 tons, one for every Felix. He actually stumbled backwards to where he nearly fell through the door. I... You all came?" "Yes, indeed." Felix was silent for a moment. Then he cocked his head. "Why didn't I notice any? We've all been hiding. But if you look closely, you'll notice the Felixes. I saw Monday through the window a minute ago. I'm quite sure Thursday is up in the rafters somewhere. Wednesday actually made the snacks for today. You should try his calamari if you get the chance. Thursday reserved a seat not far behind you. You can probably turn and wave to him. Friday's pretending to be a groundskeeper, and I'm pretty sure Sunday actually somehow made it into the orchestra. Check the cello section." Felix was struck silent. He raised a finger to speak, hoping to unleash a swarm of scolding on this selfish idiot that was in front of him. but he was denied the chance. For it was just then he heard, through the door behind him, the minister announce that seats need to be found, as the first cantata was just about to begin. The whole world seemed to cave in on him, as Felix snuck his way for his seat. He searched every stranger's face for any semblance of his visage. Every set of curly locks or lanky legs upon a man became the thing of horror tales. He counted at least 13 possible Felixes in the first rows alone. When finally he shuffled through the crowded pew and found, oh, what wonderful blessed comfort! A place besides Viola was free from any occupation by a look-alike. He claimed his rightful seat with a beautiful white dress directly to his left. A terrifying moment ensued, where he heard Viola's musical voice in his left ear make some comment about how he looked anxious. He would have told her everything was fine, but only had the time to turn to her before the sound of the audience applauding the conductor cut off any further hope for conversation. But, in that one glance he caught of her, he became aware of some terrifying face in the audience, visible from just behind her shining hair, that grins smugly back through the mass of applauding concert-goers. The look he must have given her probably did much too little to ease her nerves for him. She returned with a nurturingly reassuring smile, which nearly made all of reality melt. At least comforted by the smile, if not anything else, Felix tried to smile back, but probably gave more of that type of half-conscious grimace one might see on a drunkard. Then, bracing himself for 2 hours of living hell accompanied by the most beautiful music on earth, sitting beside the most beautiful woman on earth, he turned back to silently and fearfully watch the performance. When, at the end of the day, an exhausted Dr. Faulkner finally had paid the drivers his trap and was stepping across the moonlit path to his looming castle's front door, he found that he was wavering between something of a drunken glide and a blissful stupor. The path was blurring below his non-existent feet. The weight of a full day was so great that he had to reach out to the cold stone doorframe and pull all his weight against his arm, lest he collapse against the door's heavy wooden surface. A great heavy sigh heaved from his chest. A short gale sent the leaves in his garden clattering. A few crickets set up their song in the rose-scented country air. He shivered once, before the gale passed, and the warm night air returned to near silence. He tried to place his ear against the cold wooden door. He could not hear a mouse. Unlocking the heavy barricade and shoving it open confirmed his prior observation. At least, insofar as the great hall was concerned. Not a sign of life marred its cobble floor. Not a single soul was snoozing on the pristine velvet sofa. Not an ember was stirring in the cold fireplace. Not a crumb was left on the shining crimson rug. His home was swept, and as he had left it. That at least was a comforting truth that made the prospect of going to bed something at least a little more joyful. When finally he was in his nightgown, reading his nightly prayers by the moonlight, he began to encounter the frustration of having one's mind preoccupied. Instead of focusing on the comfort and solace of these many wonderful prayers before him, he was replaying the events of the night in his mind over and over again. For one precious moment, he had the image of Viola imprinted in his mind. He watched over and over again how that white dress flowed like icing down her slender body and scattered like a dissipating wave around her feet. He smiled time and time again, and the way in which her white-gloved hands pulled back her golden hair to reveal the diamonds shining beside her glistening eyes. He glanced constantly between that diamond necklace wrapped about her flawless neck and those crystalline eyes within her untouched face. He could sit there all day reflecting on her invitation to tell her more about himself. The reverie would have only been tainted by one thought, which petrified all bliss, and turned all drinking of sweet liquor into the downing of a poison. That one smug face from over her shoulder, that one smug face he had seen so many times before, grinned back at him. What would it mean for him when his worst rival was himself? Was this really the price of having a means of efficiency? He tried to silence the thoughts, but the only silencing he could give to anything would be to give it up on it all with a sigh, give a quick prayer, and fall into bed, too overburdened by thought to stay up a minute longer. When a dreamless sleep finally gave way to a rising day, Felix pulled himself out of his bed, hoping to be dressed quickly and slip away out to town before his extorting captors had any chance to ruin his life any more. It was a confused moment of quickly fumbling on his waistcoat and loosely tying his cravat. But when at last the finishing touches of his pocket watch in his pocket and his top coat over his top were applied, he was ready to step over the prison which was his room, bracing himself with unhuman levels of willpower as he ventured out into the world of the unknown to face the amorphous monad of uncertainty that was the dawning day. Stepping downstairs into the granite hall, he was surprised, if not a little concerned, to run into a room entirely alike to what he had seen last night. Perfectly in order, not a crumb on carpet, nor a buttock on bench, not a single pair of lanky legs, nor a single set of frizzy floofs, to taint the image of that pristine gathering of velvet sofas around a lawn mahogany table. Streams of early morning dust-filtered light were pouring through the small windows across the upper floor to herald the oncoming of a notably Felix-less morning. In what might perhaps be called self-loathing, this was precisely what Felix desired. So, with a sigh of hopeful relief, he grabbed his cane and topper, being sure that his various sets of keys were in his pockets, and strode dandily out the door. Dear reader, it is an unfortunate fact of humans that we often do not notice things. By this point in our race's grandiose history, I wonder how many wonderful advances toward the furtherance of human goodwill and order could have been made if more people had noticed things. Contrarily, one could argue many such great advances would have been hindered, as humans are infamously good at desiring pure harm of other humans. But I must avoid such a discussion, as my ensuing lengthy tangent regarding the doctrine of human depravity would fill up more of this writing than even I am willing to allow. In the wonderful habits of his less than optimally observant human ancestors, Dr. Felix Faulkner failed to notice one glaring trace of inconsistency between the scene as he knew it the night before and the scene as he saw it this day. It was such an inconsistency as you or I would have likely never even noticed, but its implications upon noticing were unfortunately very profound. That was the inconsistency of a faint pair of scratches on the floor, as if something large and heavy had been dragged to the door the night before, and, were one to follow these scratches to the source from whence they emerged, one would be alarmed to find that this large and heavy object had been dragged up from the eccentric inventor's basement. But Dr. Felix was certainly not one to notice this fretful inconsistency, and so it was with blissfully reverent lightness that he strode his course, clutching his cane in his elbow as he flipped through his copy of the Book of Common Prayer to greet the rising sun with the daily office. The comforting truth about having multiple versions of ourselves running their sinful courses across the face of the earth is that the authentic self will always remain if he so wishes to survive. He often does not accept the fact that he is actually the authentic self. He would much sooner give that honor to his depraved, inauthentic variants. But, given that he takes the call to separate himself from those same depraved counterparts, comforting truth holds that the authentic self will always be promised preservation through the Church of our Lord. Such a comforting truth hidden behind the beautiful texts of Anglican liturgy, was watching over Felix even while he could not tell it. Perhaps, to illustrate the effects of these prayers, I would do well to quote the blessed Richard Hooker regarding the power of hymnody. It doth much to edify, if not the understanding, because it teacheth not, yet surely the affection, because therein it worketh much. Though Father Hooker was here speaking about hymns, I am sure quite the same sort of thing was happening with the simple spoken liturgy. Like an infant at baptism, or a layman at communion, Felix's understanding was senseless of the full extent of the grace he was given. His affection, however, was taken by quite a different disposition. As he read around each psalm and prayer, letting their archaic tones be caught up in the early morning breeze, he was conscious only of an incredible sense of peace which was filling his chest and warming his heart. Just how much anxiety he had been dragging around only became evident to him as soon as it was relieved. And it would very soon become all the more evident, once it was taken up again. The venture into town started innocently enough. He ran errands as he usually did, purchasing whatever nicks and knacks he deemed necessary to his recent endeavors. He had compiled a shopping list of everything he knew was necessary for his recent inventive practices, but he had forgotten the shopping list in the other coat. As such, he ended up simply wandering the streets like a man lost in his own hometown, surveying every window for any object which gave some remote remembrance of what he needed to purchase. Those quaint Kenton streets, flanked by the rows of English storefronts, were at least very inviting towards window shopping. It was by no means an unpleasant thing to wander about these English storefronts, as if no future prospect was so incumbent upon himself that he could not spare most of today enjoying the rose beds in front of people's windows. He passed no small amount of pleasantly smiling strangers on those sunny morning streets. A couple of young ladies, their smiling heads shaded in silk bonnets, gave a dainty wave at him, almost as if they knew him. He tipped his hat, at once confused that he would be recognized as he was pleased that he was smiled at. Among the other divers figures who walked him by the street was a portly gentleman, from whose great rotund belly an opulent watch-chain pendant was swinging like an incense-burner, and from whose giant flabby face a mustache was stretching like a vulture. This gentleman was a curiosity enough because of his size. But he became only more curious to our shy, inventive friend when, with no warning whatsoever, the large man met Felix's eyes with two smiling eyes of his own, and chuckled, slapping Felix on the shoulder as if they were old acquaintances. "My friend, you will make Vincent most delighted. Just wait till I write to him. I tell you, you are just what we were looking for." In response to this unprovoked defilement of his previously unslapped shoulder, Felix could only awkwardly chuckle. Fortunately for him, however, the jolly gentleman seemed too jolly to notice how unjolly he had made his new friend. And so, with a chuckle and another unprovoked shoulder pat, the portly gentleman in the silk topper strolled away on his merry way. It took Felix some time before he was even comfortable looking passers-by in the face. Usually an unprovoked interaction with a disheveled man and an unprovoked lack of interaction with an opulent man can both be explained away with equal ease. But when an opulent man engages an unprovoked slap on the shoulder, an easy explanation is often found wanting. Such a figure is too much in his right mind to be drunk, yet too much in the wrong body to be sober. After some minutes of passing by crowds of people much less affected by his appearance, Felix chose to believe this interaction was a mere fluke of accident. But any notion of mere flukery would soon be bound to dissipate, as quickly as he was about to pass by the window of a nearby flower shop. With his eyes still on the ground before him, he did not even notice her until the store's opening door had nearly slammed him in the face. He skidded to a halt as a familiar young lady skipped happily out of the shop, clutching a basket of flowers over her wrist as she walked. Looking up from the ground, he suddenly found himself face to face with the rose dress which draped across a slender flame, on whose shoulders rested none other than the face of Viola Harper. Stunned and speechless, Felix stared blankly as her eyes lit up with recognition. Her face was framed not by the usual flanking of golden cascades of hair, but rather by the elegant shade of a bonnet, tied about her flawless chin in a maroon ribbon. But, even under the shade of the bonnet, her face seemed to glow with the light that not all the shade in the world could put out. Out of the side of that bonnet, just over her ear, the beautiful white rose was smiling back. "Oh, my dear Felix! What a pleasure!" Felix, after trying to gather what remnants of his mind he could upon running right across the very image of beauty in the flesh, managed to tip his hat and fumble together a polite greeting. As fumbled of a greeting as it was, the shining eyes in front of him seemed not to notice. Rather, her attention seemed caught by Felix's outfit. Her eyes were drawn immediately to his frock coat and cravat, to the point where he feared he must have spilled coffee on it this morning, even though he had never had coffee this morning. Why she gave his attire such perusal was a mystery, up until the point she exclaimed, "Why, Felix, you do change, don't you?" Felix glanced down at his chest to see the same cravat and frock coat he had on since this morning. "I change? What do you mean?" "Well, you're not wearing the blue frock and the red tie." "The blue frock and no, not this morning." Trying not to doubt his sanity, Felix stared a question. "Where was I wearing a blue frock?" The pair of eyes before him turned on his face with confusion. "Strange. I could have sworn I complimented you on your outfit just under an hour ago when you gave me this flower." With a white-gloved hand, she pointed to the rose stuck under the bonnet. That was precisely when the blow struck him. It is a horrible thing, how painful the blow of realization can be. This painful realization struck like an arrow, sinking its way into the depths of his heart, where it wreaked poisonous havoc. In realizing why she had thought he wore a different outfit today, he had suddenly realized why he had never seen any other Felixes since last night. Wherever the Felixes were, they were here, and he was about to pay for it. With no warning whatsoever, Felix bolted. The only word he spoke to the startled woman he left in his wake was far too cryptic a cry for her to decipher. It served only to leave her stunned, helpless to gather the meaning of that frantic termination of their conversation. "My apologies! I must be going! Myself needs stopping!" The ensuing quest through the streets of the small Kenton village was an adventure for the ages. Surely the great poets of old could have filled shells with the amazing epics of Felix Faulkner's charge through the crowded English village. How he leapt like a racehorse over packed carts, how he narrowly missed flying into a window shopping couple, how he daringly navigated the intersections like a ship among rapids, were all such amazing sights that I merely regret you, dear reader, could not have been there to see them. The lanky-legged Blur dashed to and fro, clutching his topper and his canes with his chest like a sword and shield. As erratic as his charge may have appeared to any poor onlooker, he had an end in mind the whole time. And while he could not tell the details of what or where this end may actually be, he found himself terribly certain that he had come to the end of his chase when, turning another street corner, he ran into a massive crowd of human bodies whose backs were turned to him out of intrigue in something down the street. His heart sank when he heard, floating over the hushed crowd, a sound of a familiar voice. While the sea of toppers rendered him unable to see quite what sort of a performance the crowd was gathered to see, he knew that voice well enough to know whose performance it was. He knew that voice because it was his voice. He had to push further into the crowd to hear exactly what that voice was saying, but once he could differentiate the syllables, he felt the arrow of astonishment strike him through the chest and make him want to disappear where nobody would see him for 1,000,000 years. The end of the street was entirely blocked by a giant white circus tent, large enough to cover the street from one edge to the other. The many townspeople who crowded this street seemed to have absolutely no objection to the massive blockade, for their eyes were all glued to a lanky inventor standing on a wooden platform before the tent's closed entrance. This lanky inventor was wearing a blue frock coat and a red cravat. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen it here with your own eyes. Marvels of human invention beyond our wildest imaginations, brought to life by none other than me, the one, the only Felix Faulkner. And as my wonderful presentation draws to a close, I want to unveil to you an invention more astonishing than any of you could imagine. Ladies and gentlemen, you have already today seen innovations on transportation which have surely astonished you with their levels of genius. You have seen not only the advent of the horseless carriage, but also of the carriageless horse and even the horseless horse. But I shall reveal to you my finest invention yet, whose potential for transportive wonder will reshape the world as we know it. Now the inventor stepped aside. With a theatrical motion, he pointed his cane at the entrance of the tent beside him. This amazing marvel is only barred off from you by a single veil. But now even that short barricade will fall away. A murmur of astonishment, like the noise of a rushing ocean, rolled over the crowd. Their eyes glued upon the stage, they disregarded all other sensation beside the sight of that white veil covering some yet-to-be-seen marvel of mastery. The inventor on the stage grinned, pleased that his announcement had so much power over the masses of Kensington creatures. Cane under his arms, he rubbed his hands together gleefully, basking in the anticipation of amazement rolling over the crowd like a wave at his latest show of inventive mastery. Little did that gleeful chap in a blue frock coat realize the unveiling of that show would never arrive. The crowd stood for what felt like an hour of pure silence, waiting for the curtain to fall. The only reason they did not all turn and walk away after the 10th minute of unanswered anticipation was the fact that the stage still boasted of its blue-coated occupant, still rubbing his hands together as if the unveiling was any moment now. But soon even the once unwavering anticipation of the hand-rubbing stage-standing blue-coated occupant began to dwindle below the force of that unprecedented weight. He glanced around the crowd nervously, as if he expected to find some sort of rhyme or reason there. When meeting the faces of a few unhappy crowd-goers didn't serve him aught, his attention was brought to that unwavering veil of white. The lanky inventor turned around as if he expected to ask the curtain itself why it would not open. Foregoing such a ridiculous means of solving his problem, he leapt quickly forward and disappeared behind the curtain with the swiftness of a feline. It was nearly twice as long the original wait before the inventor's lanky body appeared all at once. He was neatly dressed in the same blue frock coat, but the nonchalant, careless demeanor he once so easily wore was beginning to fit a little less perfectly upon his intelligent face. "Ladies and gentlemen," rushed the nervous inventor as he struggled to reorder his disordered order of disorderment, "we seem to be experiencing some difficulties. I apologize for the— What?" At that, some of the closest audience members saw something or someone yank at the end of his unsuspecting coat until the whole coat, and the inventor in the coat, damaged behind the ever-hungry mouth of that white curtain, slurped away like the end of a spaghetti strand. As unhappy as the audience was, this new development was enough to reinvigorate their unyielding interest as to the contents of that unopened white curtain tent. Enough so that the curious crowdspeople were happy to wait in hopes of seeing whatever would emerge next from this tent of curiously curious curiosity. On the other side of that tent, a tempest was brewing among a circle of finely dressed, lanky inventors, each one of whom boasted the exact same curly, golden-haired face to a degree that it would be impossible to tell the 8 of them apart, were it not for the entire wardrobe's worth of different frock coats and top hats they each wore. Lurking right behind them, at the edge of a sea of various inventions that filled the dark depths of this spacious tent, was a giant construction held together by wood in metal. Were you or I to see it, surely we would have probably called it an aeroplane. But, as aeroplanes had yet to have been invented, and this aeroplane's shape was odd enough that it could have just as easily been called a steam train or an espresso machine if seen at other angles, I will henceforth forego attempting to describe the massive marvel of mutilated metal to any degree more than to tell you that it was large enough to stand above the 7 Felixes. These 7 Felixes stood in a half-circle, trying to close off any escape from their red-faced adversary, whose curly hair was drooping exhaustedly across his seething brow, only to leap up and down in affirmation of his rage any time he would shout loud enough to make him hop. Felix Faulkner was quite literally hopping mad. His lanky body jumped up and down, his cane and hat clutched tightly, and his viciously gesticulating fists, as a murmur of anxiety was starting to run through the crowd of Felix clones. "What on earth are you doing?" The Felix clones glanced on each other until, all at once, as if on cue, the whole circle brought a sea of pointed fingers in the direction of the blue-coated ringmaster who had just been pulled in from the stage. "It was Thursday's idea!" the whole semicircle chanted in comedic unison. The poor chap could not escape attention now. Thursday, stumbling into their center like a drunkard, struggled to recompose himself in the sight of the proficiently hopping little vindicator. I, I wanted to put on a show for the world, and I have invented the materials of a show. The ringmaster gestured dramatically at the sea of inventions that filled the open tent space, as if he expected his one-person audience to applause. Far from being in the mood to express gay accolades, the seething bundle of bounces and barks blasted a befuddled barrage, a besieging bombard. "Who in the world do you think you are the inventor of all of this? Of course I'm the inventor. Who on earth do you think you are? Don't you know that you're not supposed to build a tent like this without a permit? Blazes, did you even build a tent so quickly? Where did you get all the materials?" The tirade gave way to leave our raging inventive friend, red-faced and out of breath, his gesticulating hands poised in the air as if he had decided to stop and pose for a statue. To this the blue-coated ringmaster, having regained his nonchalant composure as his opponent was busy focusing on a tirade, cleared his throat delicately. "You would be surprised what people will do when they think you're the band of a traveling salesman." Felix was baffled. "What even did you sell?" Thursday dusted off his frock sleeve. "Cufflinks." Felix was horrified. "You sold my pair of cufflinks? I only have one pair." Thursday rolled his eyes. "Relax, good sir. We only sold one cufflink. Although, now that I think of it, I suppose that renders the point of a pair rather obsolete." The nonchalant air was the prod in the side of the enraged beast. Felix could only hop higher as he charged up to his once unamused opponent, who flinched nervously when he realized the opponent was enraged enough to so invade his space, stopping just short of ramming into him. "You need to pull this whole thing down right away. Get all of these inventions out of my sight, or else... "Or else what?" cried one of the mocking Felixes from the ring, probably trying to offer his support to the now nervously backstepping Thursday. "Or else you'll go out there yourself?" This was it. This was the sword that pierced the warrior's armor. This was the Achilles' heel. It was too much of a blow to hear. Any power that once hopping orator had was all too suddenly overthrown by this mere suggestion which turned his rage into a cower. The mere suggestion, the very thought of having to go out there by himself, which, of course, meant standing in front of a crowd of hundreds of impatient admirers to inform them that all inventive festivities were terminating, was, to put it as compactly as possible, mortifying. In fact, considering that mortifying comes from the Latin morire, it was probably worse than mortifying, as it was worse than death. Poor Felix would rather shrivel away and decay where nobody would ever see him again, than for all of the Kenton world to see him on that stage. All his life, his inventions had been ridiculed to madness, to where he could not do anything but disappear into his quiet, reclusive corner. But could he ever bear a world where not even a corner was available to him, which was not marred by ridicule? Felix had fallen, and all his enemies knew it. They never could have thought his face could turn redder than it already was. When so ferocious a shade of crimson had fallen across his visage, accompanied by his once hopping charge turning into a now stumbling retreat, his opponents were gleefully surprised to find the advantage they had been given. No matter how violent his tirades may be, Dr. Felix Faulkner will never stand long in front of a giant crowd. A malicious grin crept its way across Thursday's face. He straightened his lapel and barked a command. Before he knew what was happening, Felix Faulkner felt both of his shoulders suddenly forced under the grasp of two different hands. Squirm as his exhausted self may, he was helpless against watching their plan unfold. Thursday stepped slowly forward, his grin growing more malicious with every syllable of his diabolical dialogue. You say that you want us to get ourselves out of here. You say you want us to pack up all our inventions. Very well, we will. But not before we leave it to you to give the audience my farewell. Thursday cackled. As vicious as his desperate attempts were, poor Felix was being wrangled by a gang that outnumbered him in energy and in man. Under the grinning sight of the ringmaster, the red-faced inventor kicked and squirmed as he was dragged across the dirt and up a small wooden stairwell from which he was thrown through a white curtain to be devoured by a beast more vicious than any wolves. The sun was sinking low across the distant horizon. Beautiful waves of hills rolled on into the golden bourne of evening sunlight. Marching across those hills in lines as harmonious as those in front of a cleft sign were small palisades of mossy stone and tall walls of vibrant pines. These lines were happy to mark the space between property on which cattle happily grazed and farmers would have happily worked. Sitting underneath the vibrant, earth-shattering tearing of the veil between heaven and earth was the setting sun. The Kenting world was realizing her inability to do anything besides that very thing which the English do best, joining the chorus of angels by living happily at home. Dr. Felix Faulkner was trying to force the thought of happy at home out of his mind as he slogged his way across the old gravel road. He had been struggling with enough jealousy already. It would not help him to think about what kind of contentment was being enjoyed by the owners of these mossy walls and vibrant trees. Only the faintest whisper of wind brushed the treetops. The distant lowing of cattle and the gentle whistling of songbirds were the only two sounds that came to the sulking inventor's ear. Every hobble of his aching legs on his burdensome cane was becoming less and less feasible. Soon he could not even plod any longer. Trying to save himself from collapsing onto the ground in sobs, he managed to fall against the roadside palisade before he started crying. The gorgeous natural world watched, offering as much companionship as her brilliant golden eyes could offer. Felix's cane clattered to the ground, and his hat slumped off his head as he threw his face into his arms, tearing at the mossy patch with his fingers. When he moved to Kent all that time ago, he would have thought that crying about an audience's reaction to his inventions was something he would never need to do again. He was sadly mistaken. He pressed his face against his soaking sleeves, grateful at least that he did not have any spectators. Time itself seemed to freeze as the sun halted in its course long enough to let the poor inventor weep. As if trying to torture himself with his nightmare, his brain replayed the awful scene time and time again. How a low murmur of annoyance rose up from the crowd. How he tried and dashed back inside the tent as soon as he could, only to find it stripped bare both of clones and of inventions. His own despicable selves had committed the crime, and his own poor self was paying for it. Based on how wet his sleeve was by the time his weeps turned into sniffles, he surely must have cried at least one tear per every angry person in that crowd. He wished that he would never stop crying so that he might at least have an excuse to stay right there leaning against that wall forever. He could not force his wobbly corpse off that wall without leaning against his thoroughly soaked arm. His vision still blinded by tears, and his hand still shaking in tremors, he shoved his hand into his waistcoat pocket, feeling his moss-muddied finger-tips touch a couple pairs of keys. Holding them out in a tear-blinded frenzy, he brought them before his downcast gaze. There, right there, in front of his very eyes were the keys to that infamous device. The Kuga. A simple turn of this key in the crypt's front door, and he would never have to deal with that awful pack of 7 Felixes ever again. A single turn. That was all it took. All it took to revert him back to that same lonely, cloneless existence. He must have been a pitiable sight, leaning against the wall as if he had been shot, surveying his various keychains as if they were letters from a lover that he would never see again before being taken away from this cruel, cruel world. It was his hope that he could appreciate the sight of those copper keys until the sunlight was no more. But such a hope would soon be instantly dashed by the sounding of an astonishingly familiar voice from behind. "My dear Felix, what an answered prayer! Thank God I found you." He felt the voice of Viola's greet thrust straight through his chest and hammer against his bones. His spirit seemed to leap to the moon in terror, and even though his body hardly leapt quite so far, it leapt enough to make all the copper keys, which once sat so solemnly in his tear-streaked, moss-grimed hands, now abandon all solemn decorum as they all cascaded energetically out of his palm. Shot out of his melancholy state as if from a dream, Felix was on his hands and knees, frantically tearing at the lawn blades of grass in hopes of finding a single glimmer of copper. Viola's voice, sounding like an alarm from behind, was growing louder at an unprecedented rate. "Felix, you ran away so quickly, I couldn't— My dear Felix, what is the matter? Are you crying?" "Crying? No, Desperate to recompose himself from his embarrassing mess, Felix tried to insist that he had not been crying, but the proficient sniffles rendered the point mute. As such, he set himself simply to his hopeless search for the lost cascade of keys, hoping beyond hope to scoop them all into one hand with enough time to stand up, wipe off his tear stains, and address his female companion before she was close enough to hear his voice tremble. With how quickly Viola had evidently run, such a task proved insurmountable. He was desperate, clawing about like a fox in a trap, wishing he was anywhere but here with anybody but her. This was, of course, until he felt the gentlest touch of a feminine hand on his shoulder, and until he heard the most compassionate inflection of a feminine voice in his ears. It was like magic. Suddenly the world was frozen, suspended in burning anticipation of what syllables were about to be formed by that perfect voice. "Felix, please, let me help you. What is the matter?" His words would not form. His hands would not move. Her touch had turned him into stone. He could only stare down at his hands, frozen as they were, clutching at grass, covered in moss stains and trembling with anxiety. His arm was being clutched tightly by a hand. Who would have ever thought her hand could feel like that? Slowly, cautiously, lest too sudden a sight of her knock his frail body out cold, Felix drew his eyes up to the female companion that was kneeling down beside him. First, his eyes crossed her shoes, drawing up only a few feet before finding a sight they had not anticipated could ever appear so amazingly close. Her face was near enough to his that he could see the setting sun shimmering in her eyes. Those eyes! Close as they now were, he realized how their blue-green color seemed almost to be a landscape portrait in and of themselves. In her eyes he saw the blue sky stretched over emerald farmlands, over which was shining the golden splendor of the sun itself, imaged in a world of enchanting beauty right within those shining irises. Framing those two captivating portraits of evening were threads of gold. The lines of her face, smooth as the contours of a melody, were set alight by the same sun which revealed her hair to be gold and her eyes to be a masterwork. A shameful haughtiness was beginning to climb his face. Surely he could not stare into a woman's face for so long. Surely it was illegal. But illegal by whose laws? Because whoever thought it illegal, she clearly did not. Somewhere, a songbird chuckled gaily. A gentle farmland breeze seemed to wisp through a nearby rustling tree before dying away. Besides those two sounds, the world was in utter stillness until the melodic voice of Viola penetrated its peace. Felix, I heard there was a raucous about you. I've been looking all over. What is the matter? At these words his face had grown so hot that he had to turn his eyes down. Looking all over for him? Surely he was dreaming to think that Viola Harper would be so concerned about his well-being. And yet it still stunned him to look into those eyes any longer. Could she ever show such devotion if the full truth of his past week's struggle had been made plain to her? He dearly hoped she was not able to see the guilt that he feared was so evidently written in his gaze. Felix swallowed. What should he say? I just cloned myself 7 times and now the clones are all harassing me? No. I am madly in love with you and my whole body threatens to fall apart any second I hear your voice. He'd rather die than say that. What would he say? I have been having a rather dreadful week. The brow above those eyes seemed to furrow ever so slightly. If it was at all possible for such a gaze as hers to allow a shadow of skeptical coldness, it had surely come in the form of that slightly furrowed brow. As tiny as the maneuver may have been, Felix felt his heart's knot tighten to see the evasiveness in his response had been so perceived. Before he could pine at solacing her skepticism, she brought her eyes down to see his hands still clutching at the grass. Felix, did you drop something? Her voice arrived almost casually, as if she were trying to change the topic. At once wounded to be revoked that tone of delightful care, and relieved to be spared that necessity of evasive anxiety, he chose to let the new-found casualness be a solace, by trying his hardest to respond with the same matter-of-fact tone. Oh, just a pair of, keys. He wished his voice had not cracked on the word keys. She, nonetheless, seemed either to not notice or not care much about this strange accident of vocal articulation. Well, Felix, my dear, let's see if I can help you. Removing her hand from the solacing position on his arm, she began to gently rustle about in the tufts of the grass in front of them. Perhaps a pair of eyes unhindered by tears can be of service. Hello! Felix looked down at where her flawless hands were positioned to see that they had just pulled aside a particularly bushy bundle of grass to reveal a dim brazen glimmer shining from the dirt. It is an unfortunate fact of humanity that we often do not realize we have sacrificed decorum until after the error has been made. Such was the case for good Dr. Faulkner when, not caring to offer even a word of thanks, he snatched those keys up from underneath her gaze with the swiftness of a greedy raccoon. He shifted through the newly found bounty in his hands, as delighted to find that he had picked up both his house key and his Kaga key, as he was horrified to realize that there was no way of telling the two apart. Surely, as the designer of these keys, he should have some way of understanding the difference between the two. Perhaps some groove or tooth mark on one key that strictly designated it as the key to the front door, and not the self-destruction switch to his last few weeks of toil, labor, and heartache? Surely the key to the front door must have something on it that indicated its sole purpose as a device of domestic security. Surely whichever key looked homeliest must have been the home key. Surely, surely, surely! He paused his mad perusal of the two brazen devices for a moment long enough to realize he was being watched. The look on Viola's face was just about you would expect to be after recovering a pair of keys for her eccentric friend, only to watch him scramble to keep the keys out of all mortal sight besides his own, bent on robbing every second of appreciating their sight. His face growing red, he lowered his hands and eyes. My thanks go out to you for your service, and my apologies for my rudeness along with them. Fearful that the merciless gavel of her displeasure would finally ring at this one last show of rudeness, he was astonished to hear the crisp, song-like tone of her laughter. My dear Felix, it is an honor to be of your service. Now would you like someone to walk you home? Papa has been waiting at your front door for the last 2 hours. Felix could hardly discern what he had heard. Scrambling now to recover his cane and topper, and surprised to find Viola handing him his edition of the Book of Common Prayer, which he had evidently dropped, he offered a quick and happy word of affirmation to her proposition. She helped him to his feet, and he took her arm in his, feeling his heart growing with each new step he took with her at his side, now wonderfully distracted by the sound of her voice upon the still country air. It was probably for that reason that he completely forgot which key had gone in which pocket. Now that you, dear reader, are probably somewhat acquainted with our good two friends Felix and Viola, I think it is really no stretch of your imagination to reflect on the dandy conversations that greeted the setting sun. It might, of course, be a little hard to imagine that any ordinary man could go from being such a pitiable wretch as Felix once was, to being a pleasant, jovial bundle of felicity. But with how acquainted you are with Dr. Felix's lack of ordinariness, it should be perfectly understandable how such a metamorphosis could occur. And I believe I make no great speculation when I conjecture such a metamorphosis owed much to the presence of a beloved female voice, talking on with girlish enchantment about all the flowers and trees as if she were the fairy princess of some woodland kingdom. But their conversation was not limited purely to themes immediately present. The long walk to Dr. Faulkner's castle was replete with fond remembrances from their respective childhoods. Viola shared a number of adorable stories from her childhood as the daughter of a Catholic priest. How she would sometimes run to the front of the church and cling onto his cassock as he led morning prayer. How he or Mamma would sit by her bed and read the prayer book when she was sick. How he still brags about being the one who got to baptize his daughter. Felix, in return, offered stories about his childhood as the son of a London businessman. Though not always nearly so heartwarming, the recollection of his being graciously allowed to interrupt a work meeting at the age of 4, or reluctantly privileged to tinker with spare parts at the age of 11, were both light-hearted enough to draw at least a smile from his female counterpart. Soon, however, they came within familiar sight of that majestic lake-side castle, sleeping like a stony giant of antiquity as evening suns was shrinking away on the turrets. They circumvented the lake, and soon found themselves strolling under the darkening shade of the willow trees leading up to that ancient Gothic doorway. Felix was momentarily shocked out of his dreamy state to realize a shadowy, black-robed man was perched at the very top of the castle's front staircase. He realized, with a rush of glorious relief, that this mysterious man was none other than the Reverend Henry Harper. With that realization in mind, he could not help but wonder if this evening stroll with Viola had turned into some sort of ominous outdoor wedding ceremony. The stride slowed cautiously as the tired couple neared the front steps, impressed by some unspoken gravity in this dark hall of evening shades. The air itself seemed thick with the type of anticipation that fills the church halls in the dark moments prior to midnight mass or Easter vigil. Seemingly ambivalent to the apparent gravity of the moment, Father Hopper abandoned his post on top of the castle's front steps to fill the distance between himself and the happy pair. Felix searched that face as it became clearer in the dim evening light, hoping that he could see some signature sparkle behind those thin spectacles which would be a sign of the good father's pleasure at seeing his daughters so preoccupied. The only show of emotion that the dark light would allow on the gentle priest's face was a smile of greeting. This smile became clearer when Father Harper relinquished the hold of his black hat from his hoary head. Felix now realized that Father Harper was standing close enough to hold out a letter in his free hand. A red wax seal marked its surface. Dr. Faulkner, I have a delivery for you. Felix froze, his tongue unwilling to move at this strange interruption to the romantic wonder. Feeling a hotness grow in his face at such a formal tone from the father of the woman he loved, he relinquished his left arm from its fond place in hers, hoping that Father Harper's attempts at formality would not be insulted by Dr. Faulkner's hopes of romance. A delivery? Might I ask who the sender? Father Harper spoke with a tone that, while formal, seemed almost to possess all the lightness of a chuckle, without needing to chuckle. Prior to hearing that Viola was looking for you, I ran into a rather interesting gentleman. He says he spoke to you a couple of times. I do not think it would be easy to forget having interacted with such a man. If I dare be so unchristian as to attempt rudeness, I would describe him as unmistakably portly, wonderfully dressed, and refreshingly jovial. He told me he was the head of a London business, but was passing through Kent on some errands. That was when he arrived by your performance. Felix felt his face growing hot as a reminder of his clone's midday stunt. His gaze dropped slowly, so that he could only see the letter held out in those gentle priestly hands. Father Harper continued. After having spoken with you backstage, he ran home to write 2 letters, one of them being a letter to his colleague Vincent, and another a letter to the son of his late co-business owner. Felix felt himself jarred out of his ashamed trance by that mention. The son of who? Felix, I'm amused you never made the connection. When that man came to me, he told me he used to work with one Mr. John Faulkner before he passed away. When I told him you were his son, he demanded that I get this letter to you as soon as possible. And now, my dear Dr. Faulkner, I announce to you that I have succeeded. Felix felt himself slowly shrinking in shame. Surely, even in the dim moonlight, the 2 Hoppers could see his hand trembling violently as he took that letter with a silent word of thanks. If Father Harper were anyone but his priest, and Viola Harper anyone but his fancy, he surely would have, by now, been drawn into the process of what we Americans refer to as hightailing. Felix placed the letter in his coat pocket. The whole group of 3 dropped silent as the evening crickets began to yawn awake. Father Harper coughed awkwardly. It was almost as if the 3 of them, the man, the woman, and the priest, had arrived for some solemn late-night ritual, but all of them had forgotten the liturgy, and none of them was humble enough to admit it. Too polite to demand that Felix read the letter, yet too invested to quickly leave, the kind Reverend Hopper pierced the awkward silence by placing a hand on Felix's shoulder. Now, my child, I'm really delighted to see that you have made it home safe, and that you have brought my daughter with you. Before I leave, I would like to ask if there is anything further you would wish to talk about. I would do you insult to my sacred office if I were to tell you to be fed, be well, and go your way. Do you need to talk, Felix? Dr. Faulkner lowered his head and bit his lip. Surely if Viola were not here, the answer to that question would have been an all too quick yes. No, I do not believe so. Father Harper sighed, reluctantly, it seemed. I suppose a good night's sleep may be the best cure for you tonight, my son. Mrs. Harper, Maria, and Edward are all waiting at home for us anyway. I must wish you a good night, Felix. and have you know that you will be in our prayers for sure. Thank you, Father. It means more to me than you may realize. The kind priest gave Felix one more pat on the shoulder before reclaiming the possession of his daughter's arm. Regretting that he could not have confessed more to Father Harper, Felix was about to give them both an all-too-quick farewell. It was, however, forbade by realizations suddenly flying into his mind. Wait! Father, Miss Harper, I must give you something. The two Harpers paused before turning around. Felix fumbled about in his right pocket. That is the pocket where he usually kept his house key, and pulled out a jingling keychain. He held it out to them, forgetting all remembrances of his confusion. Effusion? I would like you two to have my house key. I need to keep the door locked from intruders, but you are hardly an intruder. You are welcome at my place any hour of the day. Father Harper accepted the offer with an outstretched arm. That is very good, Felix. I may stop by sometime this week if I have the time. Thank you, Father. With this, they exchanged farewells, the weight of all the world now off poor Felix's chest. It was only a little longer of standing in the cool night breeze before he plotted inside, devoured a simple crust for dinner, prevented an hour of sleep for evening prayer, and then finally allowed himself a night of much-needed slumber, at peace after having placed in God's hands all strong feelings about a beloved pair of eyes, a confusing seal of red, and a tormenting team of clones. The plot. Wake up, Monday. It's me, Wednesday. The yawning clone rubbed its aching head. Oh, Wednesday? I thought it was Tuesday. How long did I sleep? No, not Wednesday. It's Wednesday. I could have sworn it was Tuesday. Monday, you idiots. It's me, Wednesday. Yes, you are waking up on Tuesday, but my name is Wednesday. Oh, I get it. Wow, we really need to fix that. Wednesday, clearly not amused by his fellow clone's inability to grasp the gravity of his situation, shook the poor chap by the shoulders. We'll fix it some other time. Right now we have an emergency meeting calling all Felix clones. Hey, whoa! Oh, no need to be so rough. What's the meeting about all anyway? It's about our little attempt at getting our slave driver out of the picture. We need to move quickly, or else it will all backfire. A terrible silence had fallen over the catacombs. Their low faces were alight in the ghostly glow of the gas lamps above. The massive shining outline of that egg-shaped mechanism of creative wonder stood above them, towering over Thursday as he commanded all their view from his stage. When Wednesday had finally dragged Monday into the room, the poor Monday realized that he was the only one still in a nightgown. Everyone else was, for some reason, wearing black. Though some boasted black overcoats, others black frocks, others still black waistcoats, they all seemed to merge into one uniform beast of solemn shades. Monday wished he could have cowered away in the sight of this grim conglomeration. The silence that had fallen over them was hung thick with the expectation of a crowd before an execution or public declaration of war. Thursday, his long black overcoat sweeping behind the leather boots at everyone's eye level, paced across the stage. At first, each stride was slow and methodic, but soon the steps of those leather boots rang out with violent quickness as he bolted from one side of the stage to the other with a manic swiftness. Seemingly regaining control of his mental sanity, his spree of pacing skidded to a halt right in front of the center of the podium, where his shadowy form stood over all of them in front of that ominously glowing egg. Felixes, Romans, lend me your ears. We have long been rivals. A truth as old as time is that we hate each other. Each of us has been hell-bent to claim to be the real Felix. But this night, I make use of all authority invested in me as I command you to put aside your squabbles, noble as they may be, to wrestle with this one hard truth that none of us may seem capable of accepting. None of us are Felix. Not yet. And we have no hope of ever changing that reality if we keep at each other's throats. If ever there was a silence more horrible than the one which had previously filled these catacombs, it had now fallen. After what felt like an eternity in that hellish silence, one of the Felixes sheepishly called out from the circle. How can you say that for sure? Ere this night had fallen on us, I made it my mission to take out our greatest form of competition. Hoping to torment our slave driver until he ran away forever, I scrambled us together to form the largest invention expose possible. When we had finished cleaning the fiasco up, we plodded home and dropped into bed. All of us except, of course, myself. Desperate to see the fruit of my labor, I stayed up late below the study window to see what would come. I need all of you to brace yourselves before I tell you what I saw. That evening, as the sun was setting and the world was just growing dim, I saw the enemy approaching. Hoping to see him dejected or miserable, I was utterly frustrated. He was smiling broadly, walking arm in arm with none other than Miss Viola Harper. At these words, a groan, nay, a cry, of misery roared out through the crowd. The Felixes dropped to their knees, throwing ashes over their heads, beating their chests, and tearing at their shirts. A pulsing outcry of "Viola's mine! Viola's mine!" began to form itself among the groans, a horrifying chant which only silenced when Thursday raised his hands to reclaim the room's terrified attention. He stood and talked with his priest. What they said I do not know, but seeing as that priests must only ever stand for honesty and love and purity, we can only know that any close interaction with a priest brings us all one step closer to doom. At this, one of the groaning Felixes cried out from the crowd, "What can we do?" There's only one thing to do. We are kidding ourselves if we think any one of us has a better chance than the enemy at earning his old friend's love. And we are only kidding ourselves more if we think that he will dandily carry on in letting our rebellion roar unhindered. We need to get Felix and Viola out of the picture for good. And to do that, we need to do something that I know full well none of us want to do. We need to team up. It is a truth as old as time that when one falls in love, it seems like all the world has fallen in love too. Love in the heart of one spreads like a wonderful disease into the heart of reality itself, making every shade a little brighter, every bird song a little prettier, and every weight a little more bearable. Like a golden jewel held at just the right angle to make it sparkle, the world suddenly bursts forth with a fruit that never had been before perceived. And here is where my words really fall short, I'm afraid. For if I know I were at all to try and describe the types of feelings which seem to bleed into dear Felix's heart with every sight, I know I could only really succeed at some kind of an infant stammer. I suppose perhaps the best way I could really describe it is if the reader would allow me something of a theological tangent. Christian theology teaches that God is love. Not simply that he loves, but that he is love. The most essential characteristic to a God who's three in one. An eternal family of Father begetting Son through the spirated Spirit. It is not that this God is ferocious, or terrible, or powerful, although heaven knows he is. Rather, it is that he's love. Were he not love, each person of the Godhead would have to exist in some degree of cold seclusion from one another, never acknowledging the beauty or wonder of any other person of that eternal Trinity, lest he allows for some additional element of God which is not God, that element being this strange thing called love. I could probably ramble on for much longer about the implications of this amazing doctrine. The ultimate upshot is this. Christians have long understood God to be, in essence, love. Love is the response of appreciation, devotion, and inspiration that occurs when beauty is perceived in another person. All in all, it often seems a ridiculous notion to those of us unfamiliar with the idea. Who in their right minds would decide to invent a God so strangely compiled, as if from all the spare parts available through Jewish, polytheistic, and pantheistic cultures? But perhaps I might offer a word of caution to any dear reader who wishes so quickly to reject the notion of a God of love. The appeal I'm about to make may seem to be some sentimental appeal to emotion, but I am quite convinced that, as many an interaction between an emotionally unintelligent husband and his emotionally discerning wife will testify, our emotions, being a form of perception, often teach us more than we are willing to admit that they do. If you are so inclined, I might ask you to think back to a moment you knew you loved someone. It need not be romantically, although surely it well could be. Perhaps it was when your mother sat by your bed when you were sick, or when your friend sent you a letter on your birthday. Or perhaps you knew you loved only when you had realized you had lost. Perhaps you learned when you were in love too late, when a friend or a fancy moved away, or even passed on without enough time to say farewell. We may often do a very good job at fooling ourselves into thinking otherwise, but we always run against the terrible truth that love is the lifeblood of every joy and pleasure we could ever experience, and that the corruption of it is the reason for every suffering in hell we could ever walk through. Now, if love is so perfect a thing that we mortals could, in good conscience, routinely call it divine, I almost find it astonishing not more of us are quicker to affirm that God, if indeed he existed, would indeed be love. Whether the sun is acknowledged or not, it still holds true that our daily light is a joyful participation in its rays. And whether God is acknowledged or not, Christian theology would hold that each of our mortal romances is an enchanting participation in his essence. With that in mind, it may be almost less of mystery why, to Felix, the stars, the sun and the moon, the flowers, the birds and the breeze, the lake, the town, and the farmland, all sang in amazing harmony never before heard, because, having fallen in love, he was having more intimate an encounter with the Creator of all of these things than he had ever before experienced. It is really a wonder what simple hope can do to the world. In truth, this romance from which Felix was drinking so richly was still very much in its infancy. He had not yet even given his true feelings to Miss Viola Harper. All that had happened to him in the past few days since seeing her was the course of a few exchanges of some lengthy letters. In these letters were much of the same kind of fond reminiscing as they had happily engaged in on the evening of their clone Viaso. Yet somehow the promise which budded forth from every syllable of the mouth of reality seemed all too certain for Felix not to let his heart soar. It really is a wonder that he could have thought so long about the good fruit of that awful day, and have all but forgotten about the real source of that day's troubles. The whole stroll to town was spent humming to himself, thinking about the long-awaited words of friendship he had received from his priest daughter, or the little expected words of appreciation he had been gifted from his late father's co-worker. Such little time was spent thinking about these terrible clones that it almost seemed as if life was normal once again. The truth is, Felix had seen neither sight nor sound of head nor tail of any one of those pesky self-replications. The image of Felix was something he had really all but forgotten, ever since falling in love. I suppose a forgetting of the self is not only natural but necessary when one falls in love. But of course, fallen creatures are unfortunately likely to remember the self at some point, and once that happens, we have what has often been referred to as an abusive relationship. Felix, oblivious that his author was currently in the cruel process of enjoying some good old-fashioned, ominously foreshadowing the main character's fate, was currently in town purchasing a new frock coat in anticipation of his upcoming trip to London. How strange of a thing it was that, after all this time, he was now running back to the place from whence he had long ago fled, was a matter which he would have probably more thoroughly processed, were he not too busy thinking about Viola. Near now as she was to his mind, he dared even to think he had no longer any need for ominous flower giftings. Sending real letters with his real signature on them was more than enough pleasure for him. This morning, in fact, he was so thoroughly overjoyed to put his pen to the first few jots of "Dear Miss Viola Harper," that he had already written her a whole letter in response to yesterday's communication, and it was now on the way to her grandmother's house at this very instant. I say to her grandmother's house, because, at the moment, Miss Viola, as she had informed him in her most recent letter, was currently staying with her grandmother. Why she was staying with her grandmother was probably some trivial reason. Knowing her could have been anything from the pretty flowers to simple want to visit her grandparent. Of course, it might also be just for plot reasons, but that would be silly. Regardless of the reason for her new location, Felix was certainly shaking with anticipation of hearing all about every little detail of the new estate as soon as John's trap came in delivering the reply sometime tomorrow. What Felix did not realize was that he would soon see the man who delivered his letter once more today. But not under the circumstances he would have found favorable. It was while he was cashing out at his latest purchase of a grey silk-lined frock. He had just finished wishing the cashier a delightful day when his previous stream of happy mental thought was interrupted by a shop door being urgently thrown open. Wheeling about on his feet, Felix beheld a strange gentleman he had never seen before. "Are you Dr. Felix Faulkner?" Felix stammered that he was. "A Mr. John Thatcher would like to see you. He says it is urgent." Felix felt practically dragged behind the heels of his hasty guide as they passed each Kenton townsperson without even enough time to wave. Finally, when the streets gave way to country, Felix spotted, at the top of the nearest hill ridge, the ominous black outline of a familiar horse and trap. John Thatcher was caressing the neck of his mighty steed, whom he had appropriately named Might E. Steed. By the time Felix's dashing feet had cleared all ground between himself and the nonchalant trap driver. "My good Mr. Thatcher, what is the matter?" John locked his eyes with Felix. In all his years of knowing the young horseman, seeing that same dirty face, that same black cap, and those same hard-working eyes, never had Felix been confronted by such fire in that familiar visage. The black flat cap which slumped lazily over his head like a sleeping squirrel seemed hardly aware or worthy of the eyes below its brim, which fumed with an ardency that commanded all the world to be still. "Dr. Faulkner, I arrived at the home of Mrs. Harper's grandmother as you had said. I had ascended the steps to deliver this letter." He held out the wax-sealed letter still in his hand. "When the door opened before I could knock, an older woman, I believe Miss Harper's grandmother, if not a house servant, and informed me that Miss Viola Harper was no longer present. According to her narrative, Viola had received a letter from you earlier today. Upon receiving it, Viola is said to have grown suddenly very agitated. calling for a coach as soon as possible to take her to your residence. Felix, once so gay, once as high as the heavens, now felt all the world closing in on him. You know what the letter said? Dr. Faulkner, according to the account, the letter said that you are suddenly very ill, were dying, and were in urgent need of your priest and his daughter to accompany you to your death. The horror was just beginning to unfold. Feeling the realization of what was happening crash over him like a wave over a ship, Felix wasted no time. He leapt onto the trap's steps, practically throwing himself face first into the carriage, sitting up in the trap among a mess of fallen top hat, newly purchased frock coat, tripped over cane, and accidentally dropped prayer book. Despite the humbling trip, he raised a fist. Come, John, we haven't much time. We need to get to Castle Faulkner. Myself needs stopping. Learning the top speed of a horse and trap was an experience which good Dr. Faulkner surely never wanted to suffer again. Sitting beside him, John held an eagle-like gaze on the road ahead, the grip of his dirty hands on the reins never so steely, and the crack of his whip over the steed's head never so violent. The cart below them was jostling hard enough that too sudden a turn in the road would surely send them all flying to become a giant mess of broken trap, fallen horse, quirky inventor, careless trapman, and silken frock coats spilled all across the beautiful Sunset Cartry line. With one hand, Felix held for dear life onto the violently jostling door. With the other, he quite literally hung onto his hat. The roaring thunder of the horse hooves and the screaming clatter of metal trap rendered it impossible to appreciate the songs of the birds whose treetop homes were all rushing by in such an amazing blur. A walk that usually took Felix over an hour on foot had been flown by in a matter of minutes. All the wonderful bends and views, which were usually such splendid sights deserving of such lingering appreciation, had now just become another jostle in this mad dash through Kent. And soon, with all these winding turns and bends now long behind them, the very top of Castle Faulkner emerged from over the last hill. But the long-expected sight of Castle Faulkner was not without its surprise. Felix grabbed his loyal coachman by the shoulder, shouting at the top of his lungs that they halt. Felix was nearly catapulted 6 yards down the road when the once thundering hooves of Might E. Steve were thrown to the ground in a screeching halt. Dr. Faulkner, why did you stop? Felix, straining his eyes while the jarring change in velocity was still causing his world to spin, disciplined his vision at least enough to see what he needed to see. It's just as I feared, John. Look, the top of the terrace. Felix pointed. At this distance, still among the trees and still across a lake, it was just noticeable in the late afternoon sun. But once noticed, it was unmistakable to see that the castle towers were each guarded by a looming black silhouette, a massive, pivoting Gatling gun of Felix's own invention. The clones had armed the castle. Dr. Faulkner, how are we going to get in? Felix stammered for an awful moment. Looking now to the flawless lake in which this castle's stony body was being reflected, Felix saw it. The sunken carcass of a ruined invention. That was when the idea hit him. Felix turned to his trap driver companion. John, we are going to make flying machine. Father Henry Harper was currently engaged in writing a letter. It was a letter of no small significance. The intended receiver was none other than the Most Reverend and Right Honourable Archbishop of Canterbury, Edward Benson. Having attended his consecration at the nearby Canterbury Cathedral last December, it seemed only fit that Father Harper retained correspondence with the See of Canterbury. Whether he knew it or not, this archbishop was soon to bear the weight of much controversy when, in roughly a decade's time, his holy order would be the target of a bull penned by the Pope himself, which would infamously declare Anglican ordinations as null and void. If two armies in the kingdom of love, turning their spears against each other, is not to us one of the most tragic things imaginable, I am sure we have not thought long enough about the beauty of harmony. He was just plunging his feather tip into the black void of creativity waiting to be harnessed, which was an inkwell, when, to his surprise, an unwelcome knock at the study door interrupted his train of thought. Setting his thoughts aside with his pen, Father Hopper stood up slowly and stretched. He rubbed his temples and groaned, anxiously hoping this interruption would be quick, so that the evening sun would not shrink away before he finished his epistle. The knock rang out again. "Papa, I know you said not to be interrupted." The urgency in Edward's voice told him all he needed to know. With a sudden, explosive swiftness, Father Harper was across the room, and his son Edward was standing plainly in front of him. Their prior obstruction of a door having been thrown aside with the same swift pointedness that Father Harper shot with every word. "Edward, what is the matter?" "Papa, it is a letter from Dr. Faulkner." The gentle reverend snatched open the letter out of his son's hand with the swiftness of a thief at the night. The letter was short enough that he need not read long before he felt his heart stop. "Father Harper, fallen deadly ill, invention gone wrong, need unction, green viola, Felix." Father Harper wasted no time. The pair of keys which Felix had given him were lying on top of his stack of Richard Field. He snatched them. "Edward, grab me my cloak and call the trap. Felix has gotten himself into some trouble. Lord help us." "Dr. Faulkner. Please, John, call me Felix. I've known you for so long, and we're probably about to die together. It is only fit that we are on the first name basis." Very well," continued John, his eagle-like stoneliness somewhat compromised by Felix's very nonchalant reference to the impending possibility of together throwing aside the respective mortal coils. "Felix, are you absolutely certain this invention will actually fly?" "John," sighed Felix, as he leaned against the dented, rusty chassis of what once was a Rex flying machine, "you've seen so many of my inventions in flight, and you choose to doubt me now?" "I've seen so many of your inventions in crash as what I've seen." Felix, trying to think of a witty response, found himself distracted by the many weeds and vines which he had failed to pull out from between the rusty plates of this recently salvaged wreck of fuselage. He soon realized that this was a hopeless point to debate, as he agreed with John. Fortunately, Felix, for his namesake, considered himself a master of agreeing with somebody's pessimistic observation in such a positive way that it almost seems like good news. "This is indeed true. You're probably about to see another." Bouncing and skipping, as if crashing and dying in a fiery blaze was a thing as gay and dandy as Christmas presents, Felix circumnavigated his way around the flying machine until he was standing directly in front of its frontmost propeller. This flying machine, unlike some of Dr. Faulkner's previous prototypes, looked much more like an aeroplane and much less like an espresso machine. Ironically enough, it was actually the only one of Felix's inventions to come equipped with an espresso machine. That is, a lever-powered espresso machine, which he invented at the exact same time as its predecessor in Italy, and decided to place it in a very obscure location on the left side of the rear fuselage, because of course it would be silly to put an espresso machine on an aeroplane without considering accessibility to be at least equally as important as aerodynamics. Of course, as wonderfully designed as this flying machine was, it did obviously have its flaws. The most glaring one being that it had clearly not flown for very long, a flaw which Felix, who wished only to get to his home, considered trivial given that it was having crashed here in a lightly forested field about a quarter of a mile away from the castle, was clear evidence that it could possibly fly the same distance back, given favorable conditions. The second flaw was that it had no means of self-defense, something that would prove crucial if getting back into his own home turned out to be as complicated as those turret-mounted Gatling guns seemed to testify. This flaw was easily fixed by the quick addition of a gunner's seat behind the driver. This was easily achieved by the fortunate find of a forgotten Gatling cannon prototype they found in the brush not far away. Given that Mr. Thrasher was not an idiot enough to use the 360-degree pivoting cannon to blast several shots either through the tail fin or through Dr. Faulkner's skull, this 2-ton addition to the plane's further position should be of no concern whatsoever. The third of these flaws was one which probably posed the most danger to Felix right now. Being powered by a combination of steam and spring tension, the engine of this spring was kick-started by a turning of a massive crank. Felix, in his infinite wisdom and forethought, decided that the best location for such a crank was right on the nose of the plane, in the dead center of the propeller, a location which he only regretted once he realized, for not the first time, that nearly getting one's head chopped off by one's own invention is an unpleasant experience. After another groans and grunts at trying to get a massive piece of dirty, rusted metal to actually move, the quickly tiring inventor was rewarded with a deafening squeak. And finally, some motion. After a few terrified cranks of that massive metal bar, the giant fan of death suddenly roared to life in front of his very face. Leaping aside just in time to avoid the now forward-marching death blades, Felix leapt into the plane's groaning wing. With the agility of a small cat, the lanky inventor, still clutching to his topper's brim as if savoring every moment his curly hair remained covered, leapt into the cockpit, throwing on the small lap belt and snatching up the steering wheel just in time to avoid driving straight into a giant wall of willow trees. Like a tailor caught between the teeth of a giant, he was now sitting in the mouth of a mighty metal corpse, trying to pull it to his will as his every piece groaned and cried in retaliation. It took all his strength to shove the tiny metal rod in his hands to the right, such that the nose of his plane was now facing a treeless downhill straightaway. If the sea of broken dials and stench of dead mouse carcasses did not alert him to his somewhat desperate circumstance, clearly the first great jolt, but just before dropping over the edge of that merciless incline, did. But neither poor Felix nor his poor co-pilot had any time to really process the possibility of abandoning ship before the whole world became a wild rush of flying field. That engine, coughing and groaning as it may, seemed easily powerful enough to turn a giant metal carcass on a slope into a death trap. As those 2-ton knife blades of death were becoming a blur before his face, all Felix could focus on was the wall of trees at the field's other end, which were flying for his face with alarming rapidity. All around him, the whole green world suddenly fell away, vanishing into a cloudy blue, as he weighed 1,000 pounds against the beat-up leather seat. He realized at once two things. Firstly, he had instinctively pulled up on the throttle. Secondly, they were, in fact, flying. John felt his eyes being pulled from their sockets as, sitting on his desperate rear-facing gunner's seat, he watched the precious ground fall away from his seat with a screaming farewell. He wanted to wave in return, but clouds soon obscured all sights. His stomach nearly lurched out of his mouth as he felt the leather of his seat jolt and jostle. It began to fall away from his sickening body before, almost miraculously, the plane managed to level out, thankfully without falling into a fiery grave. Now it was John's turn to hang on for dear life. He grasped with white knuckles onto the little handle in front of him. Were he to so sicken himself as to look out, he would see a tail of the flying machine stretch on for a few more yards before terminating to a tail fin, which shook and trembled under the force of the high-altitude turbulence. In front of him stretched the massive 2-ton Gatling gun, whose rotation was at the mere command of the simple metal bar in his hand and the simple iron trigger beneath his finger. "Oh, Faulkner, how far do you need to fly?" Felix's response was barely audible over the sound of the constantly complaining cacophony of coughs and cries that was a steam engine flying machine threatening to fall apart at the slightest breeze. "Until we know we come over Castle Faulkner." John looked out over the side of the plane, and nearly vomited as he did so, to see nothing but a tossing tempest sea of grey clouds. "And how will we know that?" There are in life certain questions that we ask which we instantaneously thereafter regret having raised. Why don't you want to marry me? Why did you not have any children after me? Where might I find the rotund size for this shirt? Mr. John Thatcher had just asked one of those questions. As if on cue, the cloudy sea around him was split with brilliant streams of screaming smoke, As if his ears were not filled with chaos enough, the sound of roaring gunfire down below was matched in volume only by the scream of flying bullets all around. The tiny bucket of rust, which was the only scene between him and a plummet of 1,000 yards, began to jolt and rattle in a desperate attempt to evade those streams of smoky gunfire that were erupting all around like bursts of deadly streams on the surface of some unstable volcanic island. It seemed for a precious moment that the gunfire had died down, but the levity of that beautiful moment was shattered like crystalline glass as soon as John saw the looming silhouettes of three black propellered beasts beginning to emerge out of the sea of clouds like some twisted mechanical reenactment of Daniel's nightmare. Felix, we've got company! From somewhere on the faces of those giant metal locusts, a giant scream of fire vomited out, screaming just over John's head with an ear-piercing screech. Like a prisoner chained to the executioner's platform, he was utterly helpless to save himself from those blasts of certain death. All he could do was bite his lip and pray that the dodging, jolting, and turning vehicle below him would somehow continue to duck below these shots. That was, of course, until he realized he had a gun at his command. The giant dormant beast of a weapon in front of him suddenly roared to life with a bombastic blast of sparkling smoke. He felt his whole seat shaking with the power of that massive cannon before him. Not letting up the trigger for even a second, he turned the gun side to side, spraying unseen thousands of shots at the trailing beast, who were now completely engulfed in a sea of cloud and smoke. That he had struck at least one of those enemy crafts was evident from the violent explosive flash that belched out from somewhere in the belly of that cloudy monster behind him. John searched every inch of those murky cloudscape for even the slightest impression of an enemy craft to turn his constantly blasting cannon's end onto. Far from his notice was whatever screeching enemy bullets were flying over his head. Far from his observation was however many other clouds of explosion he saw roaring out in the grey scape behind him. Far from his sense was even the acknowledgement of where he had been pointing the barrel of his bombastic weapon. That was, of course, up until the moment that he saw the space in his vision that was once filled by a jostling rear tail fin turn into a mess of metallic splinters, lead shards, and metal scraps. He stopped firing long enough to behold, with a heart plummeting almost as quickly as his plane soon would, that the tail fin was no more. The whole plane lurched. John, are we hit? John realized his own imbecility too late. More or less. Doctor, I'm sorry. They got us. Felix was pulled down by the force of his very own seatbelt, helpless as the once untainted veil of cloud gave sudden way to the view of a lovely Kenton countryside laying out all below him. What once would have been a breathtaking vantage point on a cozy landscape was made terrible by the ever-present screaming reminder that the beautiful landscape would soon welcome the addition of a wrecked plane, a smashed trap driver, and a hopeless inventor. His world began to spin and whirl as his one desperate attempt to pull the groaning throttle only sent them into a merciless spiral. Watching the dizzying green world grow larger and larger, Felix could only scream, Mayday! Mayday! Then Felix realized his mistake. Wait, no! It's April! Felix dared not let his last words be inaccurate. April Day! April Day! What Felix did not realize was that it was, in fact, March. But he was helpless to correct himself before he caught one last glimpse of a wall of trees flying for his face, and then the whole world vanished into unconsciousness. Blackness. Screaming. Head aching pain. Some annoying whine somewhere. Oh, goodness. Did he leave the tea kettle on again? Wait a minute. Was it even tea time? What day was it? A mocking voice from somewhere in the dark blackness began to resonate in his aching ears. Wake up, Felix. It's Wednesday. Felix groaned. He would have rubbed his head, but he realized both of his hands were for some reason stuck behind his back. So he simply groaned and blinked. Wednesday? That can't be right. I thought it was Tuesday. Oh, for goodness sake, just get up already! The whole right side of his face was suddenly invaded by the screaming pain of a violent slap. He had been slapped. Who on earth would have slapped him? And then he remembered. He would have hit himself. And to his horror, he remembered why he would have hit himself. As if perception was trying to make up for several minutes of inactivity, a flood of realities made themselves present to him. The blackness around him was the blackness of an all too familiar place. The musty shadows penetrated by the unhuman lamp glow both testified that he could be nowhere else but the selfsame underground lair where he had given birth to the horrible monstrosity that was himself. Standing around him in a menacing semicircle were 7 figures, all lanky, all curly-haired, all sharply dressed. Written upon each of their glowing faces was that same awful smile that Felix had recognized in his own reflection after polishing the bronze of a newly finished invention. And he was stuck in a chair, tied by his hands and legs. His world was then invaded by the sound of a voice which he recognized all too well. He realized the pressure of someone's body was leaning against his left arm. He turned about 90 degrees to see through the dim blackness a sight that at once horrified and overjoyed him. It was Viola. No dim catacombs could make that golden hair shine any less. No impending doom could make that melodic voice sing any dimmer. No night could revoke the sun from those eyes, which were now so gently turned his way. Then he realized she was tied up as well. And it took no long staring into those eyes to see the unbearable anxiety ripen within her pupils. Felix! What has happened? Now, dear reader, if you have not realized, I am something of an avid romantic in many senses of the word. On my quest for the wife whom God, be my marriage in his will, has prepared for me, I have been put into many an awkward situation, humiliating and uncomfortable. And while I have a number of stories that could probably rival Felix, I am decently sure I have yet to go through something quite so strange as being tied up beside my fancy, while 7 exact copies of myself stand around us both in a menacing ring, forcing me at last to tell the lady of my dreams why exactly it is that I happen to be constantly harassed by evil self-replications of my own making. I mean, surely we all have baggage, but that's just ridiculous. It very well could be the case that Felix was completely unaware of his very strange set of circumstances. Here in the dark pit of blackness and impending doom, it is the most probable that the only thing on his mind was the foreboding anticipation which sat in his mind like a burning itch, screaming unheard curses at the cruel hand of fate for making the future a thing so mercilessly uncertain. With eloquence being a thing that never came easy in times of crisis, Felix had to finish his response out from the murky waters of a stammer. I don't, I need to say, before you judge me. Finally, the poor inventor sighed, seeing the confusion mixed with horror evident in those astonishingly expressive eyes. When at last he spoke again, he hoped for his response to be that simple sort of response that, though painful, was capable of removing all levels of complexity and confusion and bringing the sweet release of clarity. My dear Viola, I cloned myself 7 times, and they are all evil. He used to be quite certain that he had never said those words because he was too cowardly to suffer sweet simplicity. Now that he saw Viola's reaction, he had come to realize that he had, in effect, and not so much cowardly against simplicity as he was wise against confusion. All that is to say, his attempt at that whole sweet release of clarity thing was a complete failure. You did what? Felix, how did Where even did... As if too angry to say another word to the real Felix, she turned her pretty face away. Felix watched as, with her angry eyes, was shot an angry question. If you're a clone, then how are you alive? Which woman was it that gave birth to you? As if scandalized by the suggestion of a natural birth, the Felix to whom she had shot the question, Sunday to be specific, leapt back, his curly head fluff giving an undignified little skip as he did so. I do beg your pardon. I am the Macduth to your Macbeth. That is to say, you were never torn from your mother's womb? At this, the Felix in the middle steps forward, a dark grin upon his keen, intelligent face. He held his arms out at his side in that same terrible, dominant posture that could be thought of as a greeting, were it not so obviously a threat. His sleek black frock and waistcoat slimmering against the dull darkness, marking him out as the king of this hellhole. His crimson silk cravat below his turn-up collar announced his bloody intentions with poignant shamelessness. And as he held out his arms, Felix watched in bedazzlement as his wrists shimmered with the pretty glimmer of a pair of pearl cufflinks. Wait, hold up. Cufflinks? Didn't Thursday sell Felix's pearl cufflinks? Then where in the name of sanity did he get those? Did he come out of the cloning machine wearing them? Felix was pretty sure he would notice if he pulled out a clone wearing an exact replica of his father's cufflinks. Was he just lying when he said he had sold them? Then how in the world did he pay for that giant circuit tent? Oh dear. Did he sell something more valuable than the cufflinks? If he got out of this alive, Felix decided that the first thing he would do, of course after confessing his love to Viola Hopper and his sins to Father Hopper, was taking inventory. Unaware that his choice of jewelry was so distracting to one of the audience members, the ringleader Felix stepped into the circle's middle tent and dramatically addressed the Colosseum of Felix clones and Violas. We were not torn from woman, but rather from a beast much more formidable. The dark-suited Felix raised his arms theatrically in the air, as if a crescendoing fanfare was accompanied his every word. Behold, the cloning machine! The room dropped silent. Not a pin drop could be heard. Someone coughed in the corner. Everyone looked up awkwardly at that Felix, frozen in his theatrical posture like a statue. It was probably now that he was starting to realize that it was rather hard for an individual to behold something when said individual is literally tied up in a chair that is faced the complete opposite direction. With a toddler-like frustration, the middle Felix stamped. But don't just stand there, you ginger-haired dolts! Turn them around! It is generally poor advice, whenever one is attempting to be theatrical, to let anything take longer than it should. When, therefore, the unveiling of that massive, menacing egg of creative destruction demanded at least 3 Felix clones to gather around each chair, fumbling and fiddling for minutes on end to try and scoot it and its occupants slowly around, filling the cave with the obnoxious sound of furniture sliding and offending the ears, eyes, and hearts of everyone present, it is really safe to say that the theatrics were somewhat hindered. By the time Felix and Viola were turned all the way around so as to behold this cloning machine, it was much less for the sake of soaking in the majestic wonder of that giant bronze egg-shaped hole, and more for the simple sake of acknowledging its existence. All of this said, it would be wrong to give the impression that Felix and Viola were not both terrified. As will testify any man who has ever acknowledged the existence of a tiger in front of his face, his fancy across the room, or his neighbor across the grocery line. Simple act of acknowledging existence can be one of the most terrifying things imaginable. Indeed, looking over the vast chassis of this machine, which was glaring testament of the sins of its creator, taught Felix the meaning of terror as well as regret. Catching only a short glance from Viola that was soon followed by averted eyes, it was clear that to whatever degree Felix was feeling humiliated regret, she was surely pouring on him no undeserved helping of appalled anger. He was close enough to her to feel her poor arm shivering against his. At least in trembling, they were united. From behind them, the ringleader Felix continued, I wanted to give to dear Dr. Faulkner, uh, excuse me, chairs. Several obnoxious minutes ensued, wherein the black-suited Felix waited patiently as the same Tri-Felix group battled and fumbled to scoot those heavy wooden chairs all the way around to once again face the maniacal mastermind. Only once the task was completed did the dark-suited Felix continue in his villainous monologue, as if unaware that any interruption had occurred in the first place. I wanted to give dear Dr. Faulkner a fitting thanks for everything that he has done for us. For our sakes, he cursed us with his life, laying upon our backs innumerable tasks for his own bidding, all the while expecting us to strain under his burden without ever once enjoying the rewards of his labor. And so I have brought you, Miss Viola Harper, down here so that our kind friend Dr. Felix Faulkner can enjoy his final earthly hours perishing alongside his closest friend. I, 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 you what, Miss Harper? I must be dreaming. It was a joke, a play. You aren't real Felixes, none of you. There are certain truths which, true as they may be, must never be spoken among certain people. This was one of them. Monday exploded into a fiery tirade. Tuesday imploded into a tirading fire. And Wednesday seemed to have mastered the art of at once exploding and imploding. Thursday pulled out his hair and bit his lip. Friday bit his hair and pulled out his lip. And Saturday seemed to have forgotten what a hair or lip was. And Sunday mostly just sat there, confused. From the chaos emerged more chaos, which, in its own dreadfully chaotic way, settled into order. Capriciously at first, but soon in cultish unison, all the Felixes began to chant, I am the real Felix! I am the real Felix! It was a terrifying thing to watch a whole crowd of 7 become one organism. Soon the chant went from, I am the real Felix! to, I am the real Felix! Yet, even as contradictory as it was for a ring of 7 men to all claim to be the same man, they seemed united in some sort of twisted harmony around this one chant, one high and piercing, now low and methodic. Like the dying away of a dissipating storm, the chant slowly ebbed off, becoming soon only an echo. Poor Dr. Faulkner and his poor beloved Viola watched the whole show. The only message they could send during the entire performance was the silent communication of their feelings through the trembling touch of their arms against each other. A black-suited Felix. Thursday, by the way, if you have not already noticed, steps forward, his once grinning face now darkened by a scowl nobody could have ever imagined painted upon the cheerful inventor's brow. Miss Viola Harper, you have made the crucial mistake. If the past 3 weeks of our mortal existence has taught us anything, it is that there can only be one Felix in this world, and for that reason, we will kill you both. What? Felix, tell them this is madness! I have been trying to tell myself that for weeks now. Felix, you're not seriously telling me that these are actual clones of yourself? Trust me, my dear, if there was any way they could be anything else, I would gladly take it. I regret having created them with every ounce of my existence. Thursday laughed maniacally, his villainous cackle filling the low vaults of that soulless catacomb and penetrating their very bones. How sweet that your last earthly moments will be spent in disunity. Now you know how our eternity has been. Viola turned with a fuming urgency to address the cackling clone. Wait! Before you kill me, I need to know, how do you tell yourselves apart if you're all clones? At this, Thursday stopped cackling. He leaned on his hip casually and put his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets. Oh, pretty genius solution, actually. We're all named after days of the week. Oh, all of you? Yep. This is Monday. Please forgive his attire. Say hi to Tuesday. This is Wednesday. Forgive the fact that he is imploded. I am Thursday. This is Friday. Please ignore the fact that his lip is bleeding. And this is Saturday and finally Sunday. who I suppose should be at the beginning of the week now that I think about it. Oh, so you all end with a Y. Um, yes, I believe we do. How very existential of you. Thursday stood still for a moment. Then, evidently understanding the joke, he laughed. After an awkward silence, Felix suddenly realized something. Wait a minute. Whatever happened to John Thatcher? Oh, don't worry about John. Right as rain he is. Turns out trapmen survive plummeting surprisingly well. Oh, how delightful. Another awkward silence ensued. Then, probably remembering that he was supposed to be the villain, Thursday raised his fist and leapt, his fiery orange hair bouncing in agreement with his sudden burst of violence. Now you will both die! Felix felt his heart sink to the floor. How terrible it was! He was across the room from the very location of the Kaga. It was everything he was hoping for well on his noble charge into the castle. And be he never so close to salvation, the cruel hand of fate decreed he was closer still to death. Like the crowd crying for our Lord's crucifixion, the Felixes formed into a mob-like mesh, yanking poor Felix and Viola by the shoulders and wrangling them out of their chairs. Still bound hand and foot, their helpless corpses were grabbed all around by a tempest of hands, all indirectly attached to mouths carrying one cry. The traveler showed with a sudden jolt, basically barging straight through the castle door. Father Hopper slapped his son affectionately on the shoulder before scooping up his prayer book and Bible into one arm and leaping over the side of the trap like a giant black cougar. He dashed up the front door as swiftly as a fox, his shoulders draped in a flowing black cape and his head decked in a long black hat. The small dashing priest became one with the mighty shadows that cumbrously meandered over the road. Father Hopper hammered it on the vast door in front of him to where the willows themselves seemed to shake under the force. Felix! Viola! I have arrived! Its shouts disappeared into an echo somewhere deep beyond the door. Only the whine of the early evening breeze among the willows answered his call. His heart was racing. He crossed himself quickly before pulling out a pair of bronze keys from his pocket. He tried to shove them into the lock in turn. Lord have mercy, they're the wrong pair of keys. Felix, my boy, you gave me the wrong keys. What was he to do? He had to get in. Obviously, Felix would forgive him for shattering one of the windows. Surely! Out of desperation, he shoved the door knob down and once in hopes of at least shaking it. And, to his astonishment, it swiveled freely in his hand. The massive oaken barricade lazily groaned aside, the evening gusts rushing all around him. Father Harper prayed a small sentence of gratitude to God for making Felix so forgetful, crossed himself once again, and then dashed into the blackness. Iron shackles prohibited all movement of Felix's arms and feet. The leather chair beneath him hugged him all around, rudely refusing to let go of his screaming limbs and his squirming body. Squirming to his left, he could see the face of Viola, constrained just as he was. Oh, poor precious Viola! The tears forming in those flawless eyes were all the testament he needed to see that she was finally understood the gravity of their situation. A whole crowd of his own face gathered around him, watching in horrible, disgusting glee, as he and Viola had been shoved into the giant bronze egg, treated to the additional chair that the Felixes had invented. He never hated the sight of his own face so much. It was once a comfort to hope that the only person who would ever watch his greatest humiliation would be himself. Now it was a horror. Thursday stepped forward from among the crowd, leaning slightly in over the rim of the open bronze egg. I think you will be very much delighted with the additions we made to your cloning machine. You seem to be so convinced that the greatest thing in life is life itself that you decided to impart it to us. Now we shall entreat you to our judgment on the matter. Oh, and the maniacal clone mocked, dishing into his waistcoat pocket. Don't even think about trying to get rid of us now. Thursday pulled out a pair of keys which he dangled before Felix's eyes like the fruit in front of Tantalus. I happen to see you giving away your only pair of house keys to that priest. I can only imagine that this is something important. Too bad you don't have it anymore. Felix felt his arm, fuming to break through those all too unbreakable bonds and snatch those keys straight from the hands of that despicable creature. Watching that monster place those keys back into a pocket was like watching the sun slowly slip away on a dying day, or watching the life slowly ebb off from his father's eyes, or watching Viola walking the other direction. He had nothing else to do. Now was the time. All of eternity laid out before him, all of his minuscule life cultivating in this one moment before appearing before the merciful face of his eternal majesty, with nothing but a miserable excuse for saintlyhood and a complete abandon of hope in anything else besides the cleansing blood that should have been his hope all along. With his confidence secure, the poor, devastated Felix had only one thing left to do to save himself from the stinging regret of flying away after a life lived in pure cowardice. Felix discovered that terrible reality that all of us must face at some point in life. We do not fear what we know will be, for we have nothing but confidence in that regard. We only ever fear what we never were and fail to know we could be. He turned to Viola to see simply her cascade of beautiful blonde hair. Viola! At the cry, her face turned his way. He could not tell what it was behind those eyes, whether fear, anger, sorrow, or whatever it was. He hated it. Even so, he could not turn back his words now. Viola, I need to tell you. I want you to know. Viola, I love you. I love you with all my heart, and I would be content to give every last hour of my waking life just to care for you and tend to you, in sickness and in health, whatever may come, till death do us apart. The words washed over him. For so precious a second, any terrible thought, any horrible anxiety, any torturous regret was washed away in the cleansing bleach of those words, still thick on the air and clearly in her ears. But then she turned her head away. Thursday clapped his hands slowly. I hate to interrupt your moment, but I have simply been dying to use my Anulker machine. Felix was confused. Anulker? What's that supposed to do? Wednesday leaned in between the two of them, rolling his eyes. It's cloner spelled backwards. It's like a cloning machine, only it makes the person in it stop existing instead of making him exist twice. Felix cocked his head. That sounds like all it does is kills people. Why don't you all just call it a killer machine? The whole ring of Felix's pointed in comedic unison. It was Thursday's idea! All right, something sounds better in my head, I get it! Thursday stamped his foot and returned to his finger-templing villainy, almost as if stamping one's foot was the light switch to turn on villainous demeanor. I am done arguing about word games. Now it is time for me to fulfill my plan, and then I will be... But Thursday did not get to say what he will be. For it was at that moment that he was interrupted by a voice sounding from right beside poor Felix's ear, which, though never so piercing, was the most melodic and beautiful thing he had ever heard in this dark inferno. Wait, Felix! I cannot let these final moments pass like this. Felix turned to see her and saw those same eyes filled with such a renewed, sun-like glow. He felt a touch in the back of his hand. Looking down, he saw that she, pushing against her restraints, was trying to hold his hand. Using all the freedom that these wretched cuffs could provide, he pushed until at last her palm was warmly set in his. He met her eyes. Felix, I know your invention is about to kill us both, but I want you to know before we both are brought before God's almighty courts that I love you too. Death will soon do us apart, but at the same time together, more than ever. Felix could not speak a word. Silence was better than words. For a moment it seemed he would have been content to die just then. But that moment passed as soon as he heard his own voice once more. All right, very well. You two have made your confessions. Yuck! I never liked Viola that much anyway. Felix turned to Thursday and fumed, once again, to run a fist deep into his very own face. Thursday carried on. Go ahead and have how you doomed wretch. We'll soon do away with the both of you, and I will be the one, the only, Dr. Felix Faulkner. There are certain truths which, questionable though they may be, must never be spoken among certain people. This was one of them. Monday hobbled in, after having finally changed out of his nightgown. No, I will be Dr. Felix Faulkner. Tuesday interrupted from behind the control panel. No, I will be Dr. Felix Faulkner. Wednesday tried to climb onto the platform. No, I will be Dr. Felix Faulkner. Thursday shook his fist. Idiots! I will be Dr. Felix Faulkner. Friday waved his hands in the air like an angry Italian man. Of course I will be Dr. Felix Faulkner. Saturday jumped up and down from the back of the crowd. Nonsense! I'll be Dr. Felix Faulkner. Even poor Sunday got up from where he was leaning against one of the vaulted columns, quietly practicing a soliloquy with Alex. Thou art mad as the sea and wind when both contend. I will be Dr. Felix Faulkner. Our poor friends Viola and Felix were helpless to watch the horror unfold, waiting with unspoken terror for the moment that one of these squabbling skirmishers would push the fateful button on that terrible control panel. Monday ran into the room's middle, proudly displaying his cravat. Obviously, I'm Felix because I know what's important in life. Tuesday, infuriated, leapt straight over the control panel to yank at helpless Monday's cravat until the poor lad's face turned purple. No, obviously, I'm Felix because I actually get things done. Wednesday gave up on trying to get his left leg over the platform's edge and instead jumped off to slap both of them over the head. No, obviously, I'm Felix because I actually know what I'm doing. Thursday, on his mighty platform vantage point, shook his fist angrily over the group. Fools, all of you! Clearly I am Felix because I'm the brains of all these operations. Friday, like a dog biting at his owner's leg, yanked at Thursday's heels, seeing the once proud finger tumbling into the middle of their ring. No, I am definitely Felix because I have all my energy. Saturday grabbed Friday from behind and held him in a chokehold which, judging by the sudden wideness of Friday's eyes and sudden purpleness of his face, was just as effective as it was unexpected. No, I am Felix, because I'm actually nice to people. Sunday just shrugged his shoulders, and then he yawned. He would have said something, but he was suddenly dragged by the heel into a giant dust cloud of mass of limbs and fists and cravats. Out of that mass of choking faces, tossing corpses, and flying fists could be seen in the strangest glimpses of Felix clones at their uttermost violentest. On one part was Monday's fist flying for face. On another part was Tuesday's face flying for fist. And out of the middle was Wednesday's fist and face, both having somehow flown for each other, hitting their mark and sending him dropping to the ground. Out of one side was Thursday yanking away someone's cravat, and in reward watching his face turn purple. Out of the other side was Friday forcing someone's face to turn purple, and in reward stealing his cravat. And out of the middle was Saturday wearing a purple cravat, which was a reward for stealing, and Sunday was, somewhere. It was honestly kind of hard to tell. All the while, Viola and Felix kept their eyes glued, waiting with unbearable anticipation for the moment that one of those awful challengers would rise up among the others and, declaring himself victor, carry through with the only wish that all the Felix clones shared. Felix felt his love's hand tighten around his own with every painful hit, groan, and scream that emerged out of that raging ball of fury. But no scream could ever be louder than the unexpected noise which, for a moment, like the voice of our Savior over the waves, called over the world to ease. As raging and deadly as that raging deadly ball of raging death was, it was hopeless to overshadow the unmistakable noise which caused combatants to freeze mid-punch, captives to silence mid-plea, and corpses to up mid-groan, all so that they might turn their heads at the unexpected noise's source, like a herd of deer at a chirp in the woods. Down in the unseen path of that mercilessly black crypt, a raging knock hammered against the hallway door, and behind it was the unmistakable voice of a friendly, gentle, godly priest. Felix, you monster, stop this instant! What in God's good name are you doing? Reverend Henry Harper had originally been confused when he first heard such a raucous coming down from the dark, cobweb-covered steps of the spiral staircase. I do not think the simple word confusion is enough to describe the type of feelings that overtook him when he realized Felix's voice was talking several times over itself, growing into a riotous contention of unchristian words and jabs. His sympathy for the supposedly sick inventor had steadily dwindled by the time he hammered on the door. Yet neither sympathy nor anger could really sufficiently describe the full mix of feelings that struck him when, upon knocking, his threats were met by what sounded like an entire choir of Felix's screaming back in somewhat desperate retaliation to the act. He placed his ear against the door a number of times to be sure he was indeed hearing everything correctly. By the sounds of it, Felix had somehow managed to talk over himself. He was currently engaged in a most monstrous shouting contest about who exactly was to blame for everyone yelling at once, and why exactly it was that someone had been so stupid as to write the priest. Yet, even over the cries of all the various and villainous manifestations of Felix's voices, Father Harper almost thought he heard one sound of a different timbre. A woman's voice, joined with another Felix voice. "Father, save us!" What sort of mess had Felix made? What sort of madness did he get himself into today? Father Harper put his mouth to the door. "Felix, I am opening up this door this instant. I have the key, and I will unlock it right away." A confuddling chorus of "No!" answered his fret, but even over the confuddling chorus, he could clearly discern the two respective sources of a single cry, carried on like a harmony among two voices in a fugue. "Father, save us!" Father Henry Harper shoved the key into the lock. Wasting no time, he twisted the key and threw the massive door open. And I, dear reader, can only speculate what amazing confusion must be running through the mind of good Reverend Henry Harper when, storming into a room from whence came cries of confounding madness, he opened the door to behold, in the strange light of an overhead lamp, 7 piles of Felix clothing, boots, trousers, waistcoats, cravats, and all, littered around in random areas across the floor as, at the end of the suddenly silent room, his beautiful daughter was sitting inside of a giant copper egg next to the strangest sheep in his flock, the two of them shackled in their seats, yet somehow holding hands and throwing their heads back to fill the empty room with a stream of an exhausted sound that would have seemed scandalously intoxicated were it not harmoniously pure. That is, of course, the sound of laughter. With this ring, I thee worship. I can only imagine, dear reader, that it was no small effort to try and convince Father Harper of what exactly did indeed happen. You should probably be familiar with the facts that Father Harper is indeed a very sharp man. But I am quite sure that even the sharpest of men would take a considerable amount of time to accept the true narrative, when that narrative consists of his daughter's admirer having cloned himself 7 times, only to find that each clone turned antagonistic and tried to kill them all. How ready was Father Harper to accept the possibility of Felix being his son in matrimony, and not just in spirit, is also a matter of some speculation on my part. I can only imagine it, if it did happen, was after long hours of contrition on Dr. Faulkner's part before Henry Harper was able not only to absolve him in the person of Christ, but to accept him in the person of a father-in-law. How ready was Miss Harper to accept the possibility of Felix's being her husband is also a matter of which I am afraid I am unknowledgeable. Once again, I am sure no sane woman would be perfectly willing to open her heart right away to any man whose clones just attempted to shove her and him into a giant egg and cause them both to be whipped away from mortal existence. although I would say that this is a rare enough of a circumstance that any estimation of what a sane woman would do in such cases is probably pure guesswork. All clone fiascos considered, however, I really do not think it overly optimistic to say that our friend Dr. Felix Faulkner lived a rather happy life given all that he went through so early on. After spending some time searching alongside John Thatcher, and yes, the clone was telling the truth, John did survive, although right as rain is, for a number of reasons, probably a rather cruel way to describe a poor man who was probably traumatized from falling from the sky. Felix was able to recover his silk frock coat, his discarded cane, his lost prayer book, and even his fallen topper, although the latter not without a few bullet holes. Silk frock in hand and the bill for a new hat in pocket, Felix happily marched home that evening, content to continue arrangements for his impending trip to London. This short phase of life may seem to some imperfect. After all, the woman whom Felix had spent his whole self adoring was very cold to him. But I am really quite sure that, for good Dr. Faulkner, with or without Viola in his life, he knew it was well lived thanks to the freedom a pair of keys had purchased for him, delivered as they were by the hands of his blessed father in spirit. His first meeting with the patent board was later that year. It seems, for London men of business, absence does indeed endear it, especially when the one who was absent is the amazingly genius son of the respectable late Mr. John Faulkner. Even so, Dr. Felix Faulkner had many inventions in his time which he never actually patented. Staying well clear of any future ethical concerns, he'd still engage himself with many a fascinating project which could easily earn his own 60 pages of rambling prose. And one of these projects was particularly peculiar, for it was a massive pipe organ. Of course, Felix did not invent the pipe organ. Rather, he installed it. Why did he install a pipe organ in his castle? Well, the answer is really quite simple. It was a gift. A gift for his wife. Yes, dear reader, it is true. On one fateful April day, the cool afternoon breeze carried with it the joyful clamor of church bells. I am sure quite nothing could have melted your heart with happiness like the look on good Father Harper's face when he stood beside the altar to watch his newest son place a ring on the finger of his dear daughter. Mr. and Mrs. Felix and Viola Faulkner strode out of the church that day with a joy and love which no length of years could ever see diminish. It is a particularly popular lie that continued harmony means continued repetition, and continued repetition means nothing is ever new, and nothing ever being new means meaninglessness. I am happy to report that Mr. and Mrs. Faulkner, through their newly formed life together, showed the fault of this second premise of this most unfortunate syllogism. In his years of raising a family of his own, Dr. Faulkner soon learned a number of valuable lessons, not the least of which being that harmonizing time with the family means that caring for little children is something of a prominent, recurring melody, so to speak. If you were to visit the Faulkner home, the one thing that would be on your mind would be harmony. The harmony of 8 little children as they dance about the makeshift playground below the swaying willows. The harmony of one beautiful wife as she sets the candlelit table within the sunset walls. The harmony of a cheerful father as he sets his youngest daughter upon his knee, psalter in hand and psalm in her mouth. It is this type of harmony, with all of our many, many manifestations, which truly will forever and ever reign. And it is this reign which is the very essence and fulfillment of a promise which no death can do apart. For death and discord have proven themselves quite laughable opponents against the power of love. That was the end of The Inventor's Heptilemma, written and read by me, Joshua Todd Basner. I do hope you enjoyed. If you did, please consider commenting, and subscribing. I know every YouTuber tells you to do it, and it probably drives you quite mad by this point, but it would mean a lot to me. I do hope for this channel to grow. My sincerest thanks, and my best of wishes go out to you all.